Get your things, you're coming home. Those 6 words changed everything. A bitter cowboy, a starving widow, 4 ruthless men. One frozen night in Montana, where mercy collided with greed, and a man who'd sworn never to care again found himself staring down the barrel of redemption. What happened next wasn't just a rescue, it was a reckoning. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled across the world. The wind screamed through the pines like something dying. Elias Hart stood on the porch of his cabin, squinting into the white chaos of the Montana blizzard, and told himself for the 100th time that whatever was happening out there in the wilderness wasn't his problem anymore. Let the world tear itself apart. Let men kill each other over land and gold and pride. He'd worn a badge once, believed in justice once, buried a wife and son once, and that was enough belief for any lifetime. He turned to go inside to return to the whiskey and the silence that had become his only companions when he heard it. A gunshot. Then another. Not the crack of a hunter's rifle or the pop of someone scaring off wolves. These were deliberate, angry. The kind of shots fired when men wanted other men to know they meant business. Elias froze, his hand on the doorframe. Snow gathered on his shoulders. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Not your problem, he told himself. Not anymore. But his feet wouldn't move toward the door. They wouldn't carry him back to the safety of indifference. Because somewhere in the animal part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through range wars and showdowns, and 3 years as a federal marshal, something was screaming that this was different, that this mattered. He cursed under his breath, the words lost in the howling wind, and reached for his rifle. The cabin was a quarter-mile through the forest, barely visible through the curtain of snow. Elias had seen smoke rising from its chimney a few times over the past month, had noted the presence of new neighbors with the same detached acknowledgement he gave to changes in the weather. People came and went. None of them lasted long in country this hard. As he pushed through drifts that came up to his knees, another shot rang out, closer now. Then voices, men's voices, rough and triumphant. Elias moved faster, his breath coming in frozen clouds. The rifle felt good in his hands, familiar, like greeting an old friend he'd sworn never to see again. The cabin was worse than he'd imagined. The roof sagged under the weight of snow and neglect. One corner had partially collapsed, and the door hung crooked on leather hinges. Through the gaps in the walls, he could see lamplight flickering, and he could hear crying. A child's crying. Elias's heart, that muscle he'd been so carefully keeping numb for 3 years, gave a painful twist. He crept closer, using the storm for cover, until he could peer through a crack in the wall. What he saw made his blood turn colder than the Montana winter. 4 men crowded the tiny space, their horses tied outside and already half buried in snow. They were dressed too well to be drifters. Tailored coats, polished boots, the kind of men who did their cruelty from positions of comfort and called it business. And in the corner, pressed against the far wall like a wounded animal protecting her young, was a woman. She couldn't have been more than 30, but hardship had carved lines around her eyes that made her seem older. Her dress was patched and repatched, her hair falling loose from a bun. She had her arms wrapped around 2 children, a girl of maybe 12 with fierce dark eyes and a younger boy who wheezed with every breath, his lips tinged faintly blue even in the warm lamplight. "Please," the woman was saying, her voice steady despite the terror Elias could see in her eyes. "Please, I told you, I need more time. The mine accident, my husband's death, I couldn't—" "Time's up, Mrs. Rowan." The man who spoke was young, mid-20s, with the kind of handsome face that had never known a hard day's work. His coat was beaver fur, his boots custom leather. Everything about him screamed money and entitlement. "You've had 3 months. The debt is due. Either you pay, or you forfeit the land." "There is no debt." The woman, Lydia Rowan apparently, straightened despite her fear. "My husband never borrowed from your bank. He would have told me. This is a lie, and you know it." The young man smiled. It was the smile of a cat playing with a mouse. "I have the papers right here, Mrs. Rowan, all legal and proper. Your husband's signature, witnessed and notarized. $500 at 12% interest, now ballooned to nearly $800 with late fees." "Thomas couldn't write," Lydia said flatly. "He never learned. So whatever signature you have, it's not his. For just a moment, the smile faltered. Then it returned, sharper. That's a serious accusation. You calling Judge Langford a liar because that's whose bank holds your note, and Judge Langford doesn't take kindly to being called a liar. One of the other men, older, meaner, with a scar running from eyebrow to jaw, stepped forward. Enough talk, Victor. We came to collect. The lady pays or she gets out. Tonight. In a blizzard? Lydia's voice cracked. My son is sick. You'd throw a sick child out into a blizzard? Victor Langford, because that's clearly who the young man was, shrugged. Should have thought of that before you defaulted on your debt. But I'm not heartless. I'll give you a choice. Sign over the deed right now and I'll let you stay. Under new management, of course. You can work off what you owe. The way he said it, the way his eyes traveled over Lydia's body, made his meaning crystal clear. The girl, Mara, lunged forward with a snarl. Don't you dare! The scarred man backhanded her across the face. She hit the floor hard, blood springing from her split lip. Lydia screamed and dropped to her knees beside her daughter. The boy, Caleb, started crying harder, his wheezes turning into gasps. And Elias Hart, the man who'd sworn never to care about anything again, kicked open the door with enough force to rip it from its hinges. Get away from them. His voice was quiet, deadly quiet. The kind of quiet that made smart men reconsider their choices. 4 pairs of eyes swung toward him. Victor Langford recovered first, his face twisting into an expression of aristocratic outrage. Who the hell are you? This is private property. Was private property. Elias stepped inside, rifle leveled. Snow swirled in behind him, and in the dancing lamplight, he must have looked like something conjured from the storm itself, 6 feet of winter fury and barely contained violence. Now it's under my protection, and you're trespassing. The scarred man reached for his gun. Elias shot the hat off his head. The explosion in the small space was deafening. The man froze, his hand halfway to his holster, his eyes wide with shock. The hat lay smoking on the floor, a neat hole punched through the crown. Next one goes between your eyes, Elias said conversationally. Now, I'm going to make this real simple. You boys are going to walk out that door, get on your horses, and ride away. And you're going to forget this family exists. Victor found his voice, though it shook slightly. Do you have any idea who I am? My father is Judge Thaddeus Langford. He owns half this county, and he'll have you hanged for this. Your father, Elias said, can go to hell, along with you, his fake debts, and whatever land grab scheme you're running here. He took another step forward, and something in his eyes made even the scarred man back up. I wore a federal badge for 5 years. I know a forged contract when I see one. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave that paper on the table, you're going to get out, and you're going to pray I never see your faces again. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were Caleb's labored breathing and the wind howling through the broken door. Then Victor Langford did something stupid. He smiled. You're bluffing. 1 man with a rifle against 4 of us? Even if you get 2 shots off, we'll... Elias shot the lamp. The cabin plunged into darkness except for the faint glow from the fireplace. In that darkness, Elias moved. He'd spent years tracking outlaws through starless nights, had learned to fight and shoot and survive in conditions that would break normal men. He heard Victor curse, heard boots scrambling, heard the scarred man yell, "Where is he?" Then Elias was behind them, rifle barrel pressed to the base of Victor's skull. Still think I'm bluffing? Victor went rigid. You wouldn't dare. I've killed 17 men, Elias said softly. All of them thought I wouldn't dare. Now get out. The scarred man was the first to break, stumbling toward the door. The others followed, Victor last, his face red with humiliation and rage in the firelight. At the threshold, he turned back. This isn't over. My father will... Your father, Elias interrupted, will hear about how his son tried to force himself on a widow in front of her children, how he forged legal documents, how he got run off by 1 man with a rifle. You think that's the story you want spreading around Montana territory? Victor's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Then he spun and stalked out into the blizzard, his men scrambling after him. Elias watched until they disappeared into the white darkness, until even the sound of their horses faded. Then he closed what was left of the door, wedged it shut with a chair, and turned to face the family huddled in the corner. Lydia Rowan was holding both her children, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. Mara's lip was still bleeding. Caleb was wheezing so badly his whole body shook with it. "Thank you," Lydia whispered. "Thank you. I don't know what—" Then Elias's eyes adjusted to the firelight, and he saw the rest of the cabin. There was no furniture except for 2 broken chairs and a table with one leg missing, propped up with stacked stones. No blankets except for a single threadbare quilt the 3 of them were sharing. The fire was burning bark and green wood because they didn't have anything better. And in a pot hanging over those struggling flames was the thinnest soup Elias had ever seen, just water and a few withered carrots and what looked like boiled leather scraps. They were eating garbage. This woman and her children were literally starving to death, and they'd been eating boiled scraps to survive. Something in Elias's chest cracked. That careful numbness he'd cultivated for 3 years, that protective shell around his heart, developed a fissure. Because suddenly he wasn't seeing a stranger's family anymore. He was seeing his own son's face, his wife's eyes, the grave markers he visited every week with whiskey and regret. He was seeing a chance to do something right. "How long since you ate a real meal?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. Lydia's chin lifted. "We manage." "That's not what I asked." She looked away. 4 days. Maybe 5. Mara held up 6 fingers behind her mother's back, her dark eyes accusing. 6 days. These people had been starving for 6 days while he sat in his cabin drinking and pretending the world didn't exist. Elias made a decision. Maybe it was stupid. Maybe it would get him killed or worse, get him involved in caring again. But he made it anyway. "Get your things," he said. "You're coming home." Lydia blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "Get your things," he repeated, already moving toward Caleb. "Whatever you need, whatever you can carry. We're leaving, now." We can't. This is our home. This is a death trap." Elias knelt beside the boy, pressing a hand to his forehead, burning hot despite the cold. Pneumonia, probably, or getting close to it. "Your son needs medicine and food and warmth. You all do, and you're not going to find any of that here." "But we don't know you," Lydia protested, even as Mara was already gathering their few possessions. "You could be worse than Victor Langford?" Elias cut her off. "Worse than freezing to death in a broken cabin? Worse than watching your children starve?" He looked her straight in the eye. "Lady, I'm a lot of things, most of them not good. But I don't hurt women and I don't hurt kids. And I've got food and shelter and a fire that'll actually keep you warm, so you can trust me or you can die here. Your choice." Lydia stared at him. He could see her mind working, weighing risks, calculating odds. She was smart, this woman. Tough. The kind of person who'd survived things that would have broken someone weaker. Finally, she nodded. "Okay. Good." Elias scooped Caleb up in his arms. The boy was so light it made him angry all over again. "Wrap that quilt around him. Mara, you stay close to your mother. It's going to be a hard walk, but my cabin's less than half a mile. We can make it if we move fast." "Wait." Lydia grabbed the forged contract from the table, folded it, and tucked it inside her dress. "Evidence." Elias felt a flicker of respect. "Smart. I'm not just going to forget what they did," she said quietly, "what they're still trying to do." "Good," Elias said again. "Neither am I." They stepped out into the blizzard. The storm had grown worse, if that was possible. The wind hit them like a physical blow, driving snow into their faces with enough force to blind. Elias hunched over Caleb, shielding the boy's body with his own. Behind him, he could hear Lydia encouraging Mara, her voice barely audible over the wind. It should have been a simple walk, a quarter-mile through familiar woods. But with the storm disorienting them, with exhausted women and a sick child, it became an odyssey. Elias's cabin seemed to recede with every step, always just out of reach. His arms burned from carrying Caleb. His face went numb. Behind him, Mara stumbled and fell twice, and the second time, Lydia couldn't get her back up. Elias set Caleb down for just a moment, lifted Mara to her feet and saw the defeat in Lydia's eyes. She thought they were going to die out here, thought her decision to trust him had killed them all. Look at me, Elias commanded, and Lydia's eyes snapped to his. We're not dying, not tonight, not ever. You understand? She nodded, though he could see she didn't quite believe it. 20 more yards, he lied, because he couldn't see his own cabin anymore, could barely see his own hands. We're almost there. Keep moving. And by some miracle, or maybe just the stubborn refusal to give up that had kept him alive through countless other impossible situations, his boot hit the bottom step of his porch. They were home. Elias kicked the door open and ushered them inside, into warmth and light and safety. He deposited Caleb on his own bed, started barking orders. Mara, add wood to that fire, big pieces. We need heat now. Lydia, get those wet clothes off him. There's blankets in the chest. And watched these strangers turned refugees transform his hermit sanctuary into something that almost looked like a home again. It was only later, after Caleb was wrapped in warm blankets and breathing easier, after Mara had stopped shivering, after Lydia had collapsed into a chair with the kind of exhaustion that goes bone deep, that Elias really looked at what he'd done. He'd brought people into his life again, people who would need him, depend on him, people he could fail, people he could lose. The smart thing would be to feed them, let them rest for the night, and send them on their way in the morning. Someone else's problem, someone else's responsibility. But as he watched Lydia's hand gently brush Caleb's hair back from his forehead, as he saw the way Mara's fierce eyes had finally softened with something like hope, Elias knew with absolute certainty that he wasn't sending them anywhere. Because for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than empty. He felt needed. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth the risk of caring again. Outside, the blizzard raged on, and somewhere in that storm, Victor Langford was nursing his wounded pride and plotting revenge. The fight wasn't over. It had barely begun. But inside Elias Hart's cabin, a widow and her children slept warm and safe and fed for the first time in months. And a broken man started to remember what it felt like to be whole. Dawn came late to Montana in winter. And when it finally arrived, it brought no warmth with it, just a pale gray light that turned the world into something colorless and hard. Elias had been awake for hours. He'd spent the night in his chair by the fire, rifle across his lap, listening to the wind die down, and the silence that followed feel somehow more dangerous than the storm. Every creak of the cabin made his hand move toward the trigger. Every shadow outside the frosted window could have been Victor Langford returning with reinforcements. But the only movements were deer picking through the snow and a fox hunting rabbits near the tree line. Across the room, Caleb stirred in the bed, his breathing still labored but noticeably better than the night before. The boy's color had improved too, less blue, more pink. Lydia sat beside him, her head resting on the mattress, one hand clutching her son's. She hadn't moved in hours. Mara was curled up in the other corner, wrapped in Elias's best quilt, but her eyes were open and watching him. Suspicious, protective. She reminded him of a young wolf, all wariness and teeth barely concealed. Your mother should sleep in the bed, Elias said quietly, not on the floor. She won't leave him, Mara's voice was hoarse. She never does when he gets sick. He gets sick a lot? Since the mine. Since Papa. She trailed off, her jaw tightening. The dust got in his lungs. The doctor said it might get better when he's older, but we need medicine and good food and we don't have money for either. Elias stood, his joints protesting after a night in the chair, and walked to his pantry. He pulled down a tin of honey, another of dried elk meat, a sack of cornmeal. You'll have both now. Mara sat up, suspicion sharpening in her eyes. Why are you helping us? It was a fair question. Elias wasn't sure he had a good answer. Because you need help. Lots of people need help. You don't bring them all home. No, Elias admitted. I don't. So why us? He looked at her for a long moment. This fierce girl who'd taken a backhanded blow without crying, who watched over her family like a sentry. Because I didn't help the last people who needed me, and they died. The words came out before he could stop them, raw and true. Mara's expression shifted slightly, the suspicion mixing with something else. Not quite sympathy, she was too young and too hurt for easy sympathy, but understanding, maybe. Recognition. Your family? She asked. My family. How'd they die? Mara. Lydia's voice was soft but firm. She'd woken without either of them noticing, her eyes red-rimmed but alert. That's not polite. It's fine, Elias said, though it wasn't, not really. Range war, 3 years ago. I was off chasing a gang of cattle rustlers playing marshal, thinking I was making the world safer. While I was gone, the fighting came to my ranch. My wife tried to defend our home. Our son was 7. The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief. Lydia rose slowly, careful not to disturb Caleb, and moved to stand beside her daughter. I'm sorry. Yeah. Elias turned back to the pantry, unable to look at the pity in her eyes. Me too. He started making breakfast, real breakfast, with eggs from his chickens and salt pork and biscuits made from the cornmeal. The mechanical motions helped, cracking eggs, stoking the fire, mixing dough. He'd forgotten how good it felt to cook for someone other than himself. Mara watched every move like she was memorizing it. Lydia sat back down beside Caleb, her hand on his forehead, checking his temperature with the practiced touch of a mother who'd done this too many times. The fever's breaking, she said, and her voice cracked with relief. Good. Elias poured water from the kettle into a mug, added honey and a pinch of dried herbs. This'll help with the cough. My wife used to make it for... He stopped. It'll help. Lydia took the mug, their fingers brushing briefly. Her hands were rough, calloused from hard work. Thank you for everything. I don't know how we'll ever repay you. Don't want repayment. Still. She met his eyes, and he saw steel beneath the exhaustion. We're not charity cases. When Caleb's better, when we're back on our feet, we'll find a way to contribute. I can cook, clean, mend. Mara can help with animals. We won't be a burden. Never said you were. People will think it, though. A widow and her children living with an unmarried man. Her mouth twisted. There'll be talk. Elias shrugged. Let them talk. Nearest neighbor's 5 miles away, and I don't care much for their opinions anyway. Mara made a sound that might have been a laugh. You really don't care what people think, do you? Not anymore. Breakfast was ready, and for the first time in 3 years, Elias sat at his table with other people. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was strange. He'd grown used to eating alone, to the quiet broken only by the fire and his own thoughts. Now there was the scrape of forks on plates, Caleb's occasional cough, Mara's suspicious glances, Lydia's whispered encouragements to her son to eat more. It felt like something between a memory and a dream. This is good, Lydia said after her 3rd bite. I can't remember the last time... She stopped, blinking rapidly. Mara reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. It's okay, Mama. But it wasn't okay, Elias thought. None of this was okay. A woman and her children shouldn't have been starving in a broken cabin. A boy shouldn't have been eating garbage and sleeping in the cold. Whatever had happened to drive them to that point, it wasn't okay. Tell me about the mine accident, he said. Lydia's fork froze halfway to her mouth. What? Your husband. The debt Victor Langford claims exists. None of it makes sense unless there's more to the story. Elias leaned back in his chair. And if I'm going to protect you from whatever's coming next, and something is coming, count on it. I need to know what I'm protecting you from. Lydia set down her fork carefully. For a moment, Elias thought she wouldn't answer. Then she took a breath and began. Thomas, my husband, worked at the Silver Pine mine. He was a good man, honest, maybe too honest. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. About 6 months ago, he started noticing things. Equipment that should have been replaced but wasn't. Support beams that were rotting. He complained to the foreman, but nothing changed. Then he started finding documents. What kind of documents? Land deeds, survey maps, letters between the mine owner and the railroad company. Lydia's eyes grew distant, remembering. Thomas couldn't read well, but he knew enough to understand that something wasn't right. The mine was going to close. Everyone knew that. The silver had run thin. But these documents suggested the closure was planned, deliberate, and that certain people stood to profit from it. Elias felt something cold settle in his gut. The Langfords. Judge Langford owns a stake in the railroad. Thomas found proof that the judge was working with the mining company to declare the mine unprofitable, force closures, and then buy up the surrounding land for nothing. land that just happens to sit right where the railroad wants to expand their line. And your husband was going to expose them. He tried. Lydia's voice hardened. He went to the territorial marshal, filed a formal complaint. 3 days later, there was a cave-in. Section 7, where Thomas and 11 other men were working. The support beams just collapsed. Mara spoke up, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. They said it was an accident, bad luck, but Papa had reported those exact beams 2 weeks before. He'd written it down in the safety log, and after the cave-in, the safety log disappeared. How many survived? Elias asked, though he already knew the answer. None. Lydia's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. They didn't even recover all the bodies, said it was too dangerous. They sealed Section 7 and called it a mass grave. Thomas is still down there, somewhere in the dark, and I can't even... She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth. Caleb had started crying quietly. Mara moved to comfort him, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. Elias sat very still, processing. It wasn't just fraud he was dealing with. It was murder. Premeditated, calculated murder dressed up as an industrial accident. The fake debt, he said slowly. That's how they're forcing you off your land. Lydia nodded, wiping her eyes. Our property is small, less than an acre, worthless by itself. But it sits right between the old Thornton place and the Widow Chen's farm. Both of them are being forced out too, with similar debts they swear they never incurred. Once the Langfords have all 3 properties, they'll have an unbroken line of land stretching from the mine to the river, perfect for a railroad spur. How many families? What? How many families are they doing this to? Total. Lydia met his eyes. 15. That we know of. 15 families, 15 fabricated debts, 15 homes stolen, lives destroyed, also a corrupt judge and his spoiled son could profit from a railroad expansion. And one of those families had included a man who'd tried to do the right thing and died for it. Elias stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. He walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. Behind him, he could feel Lydia and her children watching, waiting. 3 years. 3 years he'd spent hiding from the world, telling himself that justice was a lie, that trying to help only got people killed. 3 years of whiskey and isolation and carefully maintained numbness. But standing here now, knowing what he knew, he couldn't hide anymore. The documents Thomas found, he said without turning around. What happened to them? I don't know. If he kept copies, I never found them. Everything he had might have gone into the mine with him. But the territorial marshal has the originals, from when your husband filed the complaint. Maybe. Lydia sounded doubtful. But Marshal Hendricks retired 2 months after the cave-in, moved back east. The new marshal is younger. I tried talking to him, but he said without evidence there was nothing he could do, and Judge Langford is his boss's boss. Who's going to believe a widow over a judge? Elias turned back to face her. I believe you. Something shifted in Lydia's expression. Hope, fragile and desperate. And why? Because I've seen men like Victor Langford before. Born into power, never had to work for anything, think the world exists to serve them. His voice was cold. And because I've seen what happens when men like his father use the law as a weapon instead of a shield. I wore a badge for 5 years, Mrs. Rowan. I know corruption when I see it. So what do we do? It was a fair question, and Elias didn't have a good answer yet. Going up against a territorial judge was dangerous. Going up against a judge backed by railroad money was suicidal. But doing nothing meant watching 15 families lose everything, meant watching Lydia and her children starve. First, Elias said, we keep you safe. Victor Langford strikes me as the type who doesn't take humiliation well. He'll be back, probably with more men. He can't do anything without his father's backing, Mara pointed out. And the judge won't risk public scandal. The judge won't risk public scandal, Elias agreed. Why? But what's Victor going to tell his father? That he got run off by one man? That he failed to collect a simple debt? No, he's going to come back first, try to finish what he started, and then tell his father it's done. Lydia went pale. You think he'll try to kill us? I think he'll try to make it look like you got caught in the blizzard and froze. Tragic accident. He forecloses on the property anyway. Nobody asks questions. Elias met her eyes. But you're not there anymore. You're here. And that complicates his plan considerably. So we wait for him to come? No, we prepare. And while we're preparing, we look for evidence. I told you, I don't have, not your evidence. Theirs. Elias moved back to the table, his mind already working through possibilities. They're not just stealing land, they're coordinating with the railroad, falsifying documents, covering up a mass murder. That takes paperwork, communication, records. And men that arrogant always keep records. They think they're untouchable. Mara leaned forward. You're going to steal their documents. I'm going to find proof. There's a difference. Not much of one, the girl said, but she was almost smiling. Lydia shook her head. It's too dangerous. If they catch you, they won't. You can't know that. I tracked the Dalton gang through 3 territories without being seen. I infiltrated a counterfeiting ring in Denver. I've done this before, Mrs. Rowan. He softened his voice slightly. I know it's dangerous, but doing nothing is more dangerous. For you, for the other families, for anyone who might stand up to the Langfords in the future. Lydia looked at her children, Caleb, still feverish and weak in the bed, Mara, fierce and hurting and trying so hard to be strong. Then she looked back at Elias. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, but we help. However we can. You help by staying here, staying safe. Mara can tend the animals while I'm gone. I can shoot, Lydia interrupted. Thomas taught me. I'm not helpless. Elias studied her. There was iron in this woman, he realized. The kind of strength that didn't break under pressure, just got harder. Rifles above the door. Ammunition in the drawer. You see anyone coming who's not me, you don't ask questions. You shoot. He nodded. They spent the rest of the morning settling in. Elias showed Mara how to care for the chickens and the 2 goats he kept in a small shelter behind the cabin. The girl took to the work naturally, her hands gentle with the animals, even as her eyes stayed hard. Lydia tended to Caleb, who was improving by the hour. The boy was still weak, still coughing, but the edge of desperation was gone. He'd even managed to smile when Elias had brought him a cup of warm broth. It was strange, having people in his space again. Strange, but not unwelcome. The cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a home. Around noon, Elias heard horses. He was outside chopping wood when the sound reached him, multiple riders, moving fast. His hand went to the rifle he'd leaned against the woodpile. Insayal, he called to Mara, who was scattering feed for the chickens. Now! The girl didn't argue, just dropped the bucket and ran. Elias followed, barring the door behind them. Through the window, he counted 5 riders emerging from the tree line. Victor Langford was in the lead, his face red with cold and anger. Behind him were the 3 men from the previous night plus 1 more. A tall man in a black coat with a gun belt that suggested he knew how to use it. They stopped 20 yards from the cabin. Elias Hart, Victor's voice carried across the snow. I know you're in there. Send out Mrs. Rowan and her children. Elias didn't respond. He checked his rifle, made sure Lydia had the shotgun, positioned Mara behind the heavy oak table that could serve as cover. I'm done being patient, Victor continued. My father is Judge Thaddeus Langford. You're interfering with legal proceedings. That's a criminal offense. Still, Elias said nothing. Fine, Victor's voice rose, cracking slightly. You want to do this the hard way? I brought help this time. You're just one man. You can't... The door opened. But it wasn't Elias who stepped out. It was another man entirely, older, gray-bearded, wearing a heavy coat and a federal marshal's badge that caught the weak sunlight. That's enough, Mr. Langford. Victor's mouth fell open. Marshal Kane, how did you... Received a very interesting telegram this morning from Fort Jameson. Seems there have been some allegations about fraudulent debts and land seizures. Thought I'd ride out and investigate. Marshal Kane's voice was calm, almost friendly. Funny thing is, I stopped by your father's bank on the way here. Asked to see the loan documents for the Rowan property. You know what the clerk told me? Victor had gone pale. I don't know what. Said the documents were filed just 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. But Mrs. Rowan's husband has been dead for 4 months. Kane let that hang in the air. Now, I'm no expert, but it seems mighty suspicious that a dead man would sign loan papers 4 months after his funeral. The scarred man reached for his gun. The marshal's hand dropped to his own weapon in a blur of motion that said he might be old, but he was far from slow. I wouldn't, Kane said mildly. The man's hand froze. Here's what's going to happen, the marshal continued. You boys are going to ride back to town. Mr. Langford, you're going to tell your father that I'll be calling on him tomorrow morning with some questions about his banking practices. And if I hear about anyone bothering Mrs. Rowan or her children again, if I hear about anyone even riding past this property, I'm going to start making arrests. We clear? Victor found his voice, though it shook. My father will have your badge for this. Your father, Kane interrupted, is going to have a hard time threatening anyone when he's under federal investigation. Now get out of here before I decide to take you in for attempted extortion right now. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Victor jerked his horse's reins and wheeled around, his men following. They disappeared into the trees at a gallop, snow flying from their horses' hooves. Marshal Kane watched them go. Then he turned and walked to the cabin door. Elias opened it. Hart, the marshal said with a nod. Kane. Elias stood aside to let him enter. Thought you were working the Eastern Territories now. Was. Got reassigned 2 months ago. Circuit takes me through this county once a month. The marshal's eyes swept the cabin, taking in Lydia and her children in one assessing glance. Mrs. Rowan, I presume? Lydia stood, wringing her hands. Marshal, I don't understand. I never sent a telegram to Fort Jameson. No, Kane agreed. But someone did. He looked at Elias. Care to explain? Elias pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. Sent it last night. Soon as the storm cleared enough for the telegraph lines to work. Figured you'd want to know about a territorial judge running a land grab scheme. You have proof of that? Not yet, but I will. Kane sighed and settled into a chair without being invited. Always did have a talent for finding trouble, didn't you, Hart? Even after you turned in your badge. Trouble finds me. I just don't run from it anymore. The marshal's expression softened slightly. Heard about your family. I'm sorry. Elias nodded stiffly. So, Kane turned his attention to Lydia. Your husband found documents implicating Judge Langford in a conspiracy with the railroad. Mine cave-in that killed him and 11 others. Fake debts being used to force families off their land. He ticked off the points on his fingers. That about sum it up? Yes, Lydia whispered. But I don't have proof. Thomas's documents went into the mine with him. Maybe. Maybe not. Kane pulled out a small notebook. I'm going to need you to tell me everything you remember. Everything your husband told you. Everything he found. Every conversation he reported to the previous marshal. Can you do that? Lydia nodded. For the next 2 hours, she talked. Kane took notes in careful, precise handwriting. He asked questions, sharp, intelligent questions that showed he knew exactly what kind of investigation he was building. When Lydia finally finished, her voice hoarse, Kane sat back and studied his notes. This is big, he said quietly. Bigger than I thought. If even half of what you're telling me is true, we're not just talking about fraud. We're talking about murder, conspiracy, corruption that goes up to the territorial government level, maybe beyond. So you'll investigate? Hope crept into Lydia's voice. I'll investigate. But I need you to understand something, Mrs. Rowan. Men like Judge Langford don't go down easy. They have money, power, connections. Building a case strong enough to prosecute him could take months, maybe years. We don't have years, Elias said flatly. Victor's not going to wait for legal proceedings. He'll try something else, something worse. I know. Kane met his eyes. Which is why I'm going to suggest you take Mrs. Rowan and her children somewhere safe, somewhere the Langfords can't find them. No, Lydia's voice was firm. This is our home, our land. I won't run. Mrs. Rowan, my husband died fighting for what was right. I won't dishonor his memory by hiding. She straightened her shoulders. I'll help with your investigation however I can. I'll testify. I'll face the Langfords in court, but I won't run. Kane looked at Elias. Talk some sense into her. She's right. Elias said simply. Running just means they win somewhere else instead of here. Better to make a stand. You're both insane. Probably. Elias almost smiled. But we're not wrong. The marshal closed his notebook with a snap. Fine, but if you're staying, you're doing it smart. I'll have deputies ride past here twice a day. Anyone tries anything, you send word immediately. And Hart... He pointed a finger at Elias. No vigilante justice. You find evidence, you bring it to me. You don't go breaking into banks or shooting people, no matter how much they deserve it. We do this by the law. By the law, Elias agreed. But they both knew that sometimes the law moved too slowly to save the innocent, and sometimes justice required methods that didn't come with a badge. Marshal Kane left as the sun was setting, riding back toward town with a promise to return within the week. The moment he disappeared, Elias began making plans. That night, after Caleb had fallen asleep and Mara was drowsing by the fire, Lydia found Elias outside on the porch, staring into the darkness. "You're going after their documents anyway, aren't you?" she said quietly. "Even though the marshal told you not to." "Marshal Kane's a good man. He'll build a case the right way, the legal way." Elias didn't look at her. "But legal takes time, and time is something we might not have. So you'll risk your life breaking into their offices." "I've risked my life for less noble causes." Lydia was silent for a moment. Then she moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth in the cold air. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. "The truth." Elias thought about lying, about giving her the easy answer, that it was the right thing to do, that he couldn't stand by while innocent people suffered. All of that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. "Because I failed them," he said finally. "My wife, my son. I was off chasing outlaws, thinking I was making a difference, and I wasn't there when they needed me. I can't bring them back, can't undo that. But I can be here now, for you, for your children, for the other families." He finally looked at her. "Maybe that doesn't make up for what I failed to do, but it's something." Lydia's eyes were bright with tears. "You're a good man, Elias Hart." "No," he said softly, "but I'm trying to be." She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold but strong. "Then let me help you try." And standing there in the darkness, hands clasped against the Montana winter, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in 3 long years. He felt like maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible after all. The railroad warehouse sat on the edge of town like a sleeping beast, its windows dark and its doors chained. Elias watched it from the shadow of an alley across the street, counting guards and timing their patrols. 2 men, rotating every hour, both armed but lazy. They stamped their feet against the cold and passed a flask between them when they thought no one was looking. Amateurs. It had been 3 days since Marshal Kane's visit, 3 days of careful planning and reconnaissance. During the day, Elias played the part of a rancher making supply runs to town, his eyes and ears open for information. At night, he studied the patterns of the men who worked for Judge Langford, learning their schedules, their weaknesses, their routines. He'd learned that the railroad kept their administrative documents in the warehouse's second-floor office. He'd learned that Victor Langford visited there every Tuesday afternoon. And he'd learned from a loose-lipped clerk in the land office that there was a safe in that office containing contracts dating back 5 years. 5 years. More than enough time to document a conspiracy. The guard rotation changed. Elias pulled his hat lower and slipped across the street, keeping to the shadows. The back of the warehouse had a window that didn't quite latch properly. He'd tested it 2 nights ago. He jimmied it open with his knife and pulled himself inside. The warehouse was cavernous and dark, filled with crates and equipment destined for railroad camps up north. Elias moved through it like smoke, his boots silent on the wooden floor. He'd spent years tracking men who could hear a twig snap at 50 yards. Moving quietly was second nature. The stairs to the second floor creaked under his weight. He froze at every sound, listening for any change in the guards' conversation outside. But they were arguing about a card game now, their voices carrying through the thin walls, too focused on their own drama to notice an intruder. The office door was locked. Elias pulled out the set of pics he'd kept from his marshal days and went to work. The lock was good quality but not exceptional. It took him 90 seconds to feel the tumblers align and hear the satisfying click. Inside, moonlight filtered through a grimy window, illuminating a desk piled with papers, a filing cabinet, and in the corner, a floor safe. Elias tried the filing cabinet first. It was unlocked. Arrogance or carelessness, he wasn't sure which. Inside were folders organized by date and location. He pulled out the one marked Silver Pine Mine and began reading by the light of a hooded lantern he'd brought. What he found made his blood run cold. The mine collapse hadn't been an accident. That much he'd suspected. But seeing it laid out in black and white, in cold bureaucratic language that treated murder like a business expense, that was different. There were maintenance reports marked urgent that had been deliberately ignored. Safety complaints filed by Thomas Rowan that had been lost. And most damning of all, a letter from Judge Langford to the mining company president. Proceed with closure as planned. Ensure no documentation survives. Compensation for affected families will be minimal. Railroad acquisition to follow within 6 months. Elias's hands shook as he folded the letter and tucked it inside his coat. He kept searching, pulling out more folders. Land acquisitions. Disputed. Debt collections. Rowan. Railroad expansion, Phase 3. Each one was a piece of the puzzle. Each one showed a pattern of systematic theft disguised as legal proceedings. 15 families weren't being forced out. 23 were, and the Langfords had been doing this for years, not months. He was so focused on the documents that he almost missed the sound of boots on the stairs. Elias froze, his hand going to his gun. The footsteps were too heavy to be guards making rounds. These were deliberate, coming straight for the office. He had maybe 10 seconds. Elias grabbed as many folders as he could carry, stuffed them inside his coat, and moved to the window. It was a 12-foot drop to the alley below. Not ideal, but better than being caught. The doorknob turned. Elias threw open the window and jumped. He hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Pain shot through his shoulder, but nothing felt broken. He was up and running before the shout came from above. "He's got the documents! Get him!" The warehouse erupted with activity. Doors slammed open. Men poured out into the street. Elias ran, his boots pounding the frozen mud. The stolen documents pressed against his chest like armor. Behind him, gunshots cracked through the night air. A bullet whined past his ear. Another splintered the wooden post beside him. Elias ducked into an alley, vaulted a fence, emerged onto another street. He knew this town, had mapped every alley and back road during his reconnaissance. That knowledge saved his life as he wove through the darkness, always one turn ahead of his pursuers. But they had horses. And numbers. And the advantage of knowing reinforcements were coming. Elias burst out of town and into the open country beyond, his lungs burning with cold air. His own horse was hidden a quarter-mile away in a copse of trees. If he could reach it, he had a chance. The sound of hoofbeats behind him was getting closer. He pushed harder, his legs screaming in protest. 200 yards, 100, 50. There. His horse, right where he'd left it, already saddled and ready. Elias threw himself into the saddle and kicked the animal into a gallop. Behind him, he could see torches now. At least a dozen riders fanning out in a search pattern. And at the front, his face twisted with rage even at this distance, was Victor Langford. The chase lasted through the night. Elias rode hard, pushing his horse to its limits but not beyond, always keeping just out of rifle range. He used every trick he'd learned tracking outlaws, doubling back, riding through streams to break his trail, cutting across rocky ground that wouldn't hold hoofprints. But Victor was relentless. Every time Elias thought he'd lost them, they'd appear again on the horizon, like wolves following a blood trail. As dawn broke gray and cold, Elias realized he couldn't lead them back to his cabin. Couldn't risk bringing this fight to Lydia and her children. He needed a different plan. The thought had barely formed when he saw it. Snake Canyon, cutting through the landscape like a wound in the earth. A narrow gorge with steep walls and a river running through the bottom. There was a bridge, old and rickety, that crossed at the narrowest point. Elias made a decision. He angled toward the canyon, slowing his horse just enough to make sure Victor and his men saw where he was going. The bridge was worse than he remembered. The wood was rotted, the ropes frayed. It swayed dangerously in the wind that funneled through the canyon. Below, the river churned white and angry, swollen with snowmelt. Elias dismounted and led his horse across carefully. Every step made the bridge groan and shift. Halfway across, he looked back and saw Victor and his men reaching the canyon rim. "There's nowhere to go, Hart," Victor's voice echoed off the rock walls. "That bridge won't hold all of us, and you know it. Give me those documents and maybe I'll let you live." Elias didn't answer. He kept moving step by careful step until he reached the far side. Then he pulled out his knife and started sawing through the support ropes. "What are you doing?" Victor's voice rose in pitch. "Stop! Those are legal documents, property of the territorial government." "These?" Elias pulled the folders from his coat and held them up. "These documents that prove you and your father murdered 23 men? That you've been stealing land through fraud? That you've been conspiring with the railroad to rob innocent families?" Even from across the canyon, he could see Victor go pale. "You're insane," Victor said. "Even if those documents say what you think they say, who's going to believe you? You're just a washed-up marshal living alone in the woods. My father is a judge. My family has connections all the way to Washington. You're nothing." Elias felt something settle in his chest, a calm certainty. "Maybe I'm nothing, but these documents are something, and they're going to Marshal Kane, and he's going to make sure every newspaper in the territory sees them, every federal investigator, every honest lawman who's wondered why your father always seems to rule in the railroad's favor." Victor's hand dropped to his gun. "Give me those papers or I'll—" "You'll what? Shoot me? From across a canyon?" Elias smiled cold and hard. "Go ahead. Try." Victor drew and fired. The bullet went wide, ricocheting off rock 20 feet to Elias's left. "Always were a terrible shot," Elias observed. He tucked the documents back in his coat and mounted his horse. "Tell your father the law's coming for him, and tell him that Thomas Rowan's widow sends her regards." He'd started to ride away when Victor did something stupid and desperate. He ran onto the bridge. "Stop!" Victor screamed. "You can't!" The rotten boards gave way under his weight. Victor plunged through the gap with a shriek of terror, his hands scrabbling for purchase on the swaying ropes. He caught himself, dangling 20 feet above the churning river, his legs kicking in empty air. Elias stopped. He looked back at the man who'd tried to steal a widow's home, who'd threatened children, whose father had murdered 23 minors and felt no remorse. He could just ride away. Let Victor fall. Let the river take him. No one would ever know. No one would blame him. But that wasn't justice. That was revenge. And Elias had spent 3 years learning the difference. He dismounted and walked back to the bridge's edge. Victor was still hanging on, but his grip was slipping. His face was white with terror. "Help me," Victor gasped. "Please. I'm slipping. I can't." "Why should I?" Elias asked flatly. "Give me one good reason." I'm a human being. So was Thomas Rowan. So were the 22 men who died with him. Did you give them a chance?" Elias crouched at the bridge's edge, just out of reach. "Did your father?" Victor's hand slipped another inch. "I'm sorry. Is that what you want? I'm sorry. My father, he made me. I didn't want—" "You're lying. You enjoyed it. The power. The control." Elias stood. "But you know what? I'm not going to let you die. Because you dying easy, falling into a river, would be too kind. You're going to live, and you're going to stand trial. And you're going to spend the rest of your life in a federal prison, remembering this moment when I saved you so you could face real justice." He pulled off his belt and tossed one end to Victor. "Grab it." Victor caught the leather strap with one hand, still gripping the rope with the other. Slowly, painfully, Elias hauled him back up onto solid ground. The moment Victor was safe, one of his men, the scarred one who'd backhanded Mara, drew his gun and aimed at Elias. "Give us the documents, now!" Elias didn't move. "Shoot me and they fall in the river, current strong enough to carry them for miles. You'll never find them all." The scarred man hesitated, looking at Victor for guidance. Victor was still on his hands and knees, gasping for breath. When he looked up at Elias, there was something new in his eyes. Not gratitude, Victor Langford wasn't capable of that, but maybe a glimmer of understanding, of recognition that he'd underestimated this quiet man who lived alone in the mountains. "Let him go," Victor said hoarsely. "But boss, the documents—" "I said let him go." Victor's voice cracked. We'll deal with this another way, with lawyers, with proper channels. He met Elias's eyes. This isn't over. No, Elias agreed. It's not. See you in court. He rode away, leaving Victor and his men on the wrong side of the canyon. It would take them hours to find another crossing. By then, Elias would be long gone. He didn't go straight home. Instead, he rode hard for 2 days, barely stopping to rest, pushing his horse to its limits. The documents felt like they were burning against his chest. Evidence of conspiracy, murder, fraud, all of it right here in his coat. Fort Jameson was 3 territories away, but it had a federal marshal station that wasn't under Judge Langford's influence. If Elias could get there, could hand these documents to someone with the authority and integrity to act on them, the Langford's empire would crumble. But Victor wasn't giving up. On the morning of the second day, Elias spotted riders on his trail. 6 of them, moving fast. They'd somehow gotten ahead of him during the night, cut off his direct route to the fort. Elias veered east into rougher country, mountain passes still choked with snow, trails that might not exist at all. It was dangerous, but it was his only chance. The riders followed. For 3 more days, the chase continued. Elias barely slept, snatching a few hours here and there in hidden caves or dense forest. He ate what little food he'd brought, then nothing at all when that ran out. His horse was stumbling with exhaustion. He was in no better shape himself, but every time he thought about giving up, about finding a safe place to hide and rest, he thought about Lydia's face, about Mara's fierce protectiveness, about Caleb's wheezing breath and the way he'd smiled when Elias brought him warm broth. He thought about his own wife and son, buried under Montana soil, and how he hadn't been there to save them. He wasn't failing again. Not this time. On the 6th day, half frozen and delirious with exhaustion, Elias saw the walls of Fort Jameson rising in the distance. He'd made it. Behind him, the sound of pursuing hoofbeats grew louder. They were making one last push, trying to stop him before he reached safety. Elias kicked his horse into a final desperate gallop. The animal responded, finding some last reserve of strength, and they thundered toward the fort's gates. Soldiers on the walls saw them coming, saw the armed men in pursuit. Rifles appeared on the ramparts. Elias didn't slow down. He rode straight through the gates and into the fort's courtyard, his horse's legs finally giving out. They both went down in a tangle of limbs. Elias rolled, protecting the documents with his body, and came up on his knees. "Federal Marshal," he gasped. "Need to see... Federal Marshal... have evidence... murder... conspiracy..." Strong hands lifted him. A canteen appeared at his lips. Water had never tasted so good. "Easy, friend," a voice said. "You're safe now. I'm Marshal Davis. What's this about murder?" Elias reached into his coat with shaking hands and pulled out the documents. Some were crumpled, some stained with sweat and river water, but all were still readable. "Judge Thaddeus Langford," he managed. "Railroad conspiracy. Killed 23 miners, stealing land, all the proof. Right here." Marshal Davis took the documents and started reading. His expression grew darker with every page. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed. If this is real, it's real. I stole it from their warehouse. They've been chasing me for 6 days." Elias grabbed the marshal's arm. "There's a widow, Lydia Rowan. Her husband died in the mine collapse. She testified to Marshal Kane about the conspiracy. If Langford finds out these documents are here, he might go after her. You have to protect her." "We will." Davis turned to a lieutenant. "Get this man food, water, and a bed. Then send riders back along his trail. I want every man pursuing him arrested and brought here. And get me a telegraph operator. We're sending word to every marshal station in 3 territories. And one more thing," Elias said, fighting to stay conscious. "Send word to Lydia Rowan. Tell her I made it. Tell her she's safe now." Then the exhaustion finally won, and Elias collapsed. He woke 2 days later in a clean bed, sunlight streaming through a window. For a moment, he thought he'd dreamed everything. The chase, the documents, the long ride to Fort Jameson, Then he saw Marshal Davis sitting in a chair beside the bed, reading one of the stolen folders. "Welcome back," Davis said. "You've been out for 48 hours. Doctor said it was exhaustion, dehydration, and sheer stubbornness keeping you alive." Elias tried to sit up. His body protested every movement. The documents? Already on their way to the territorial governor and the federal prosecutor in Denver, along with depositions from you and Marshal Kane and testimony from Mrs. Rowan that we took via telegraph. Davis set down the folder. I've been a marshal for 20 years. I've seen corruption before. But this? This is something else. Judge Langford didn't just bend the law. He broke it into pieces and used those pieces to destroy lives. Will it stick? Can you make it stick? With this evidence? Absolutely. We've already arrested 6 of Langford's associates, including 3 men who were chasing you. They're all singing like canaries trying to cut deals. Victor Langford is currently in a cell here at the fort, awaiting trial. And Judge Langford himself is in custody in town. Took 20 armed marshals to bring him in. He keeps insisting he has diplomatic immunity, but the territorial governor has already suspended him pending investigation. Elias felt something loosen in his chest. It's really over? The chase is over. The legal battle's just beginning. But yes, Mr. Hart, the Langfords are finished, their conspiracy is exposed, and because of you, 23 families are going to get their land back. Justice for the men who died in that mine. And a widow and her children get to keep their home. When can I leave? Davis raised an eyebrow. Doctor says you need at least another week of rest. You pushed yourself past human limits out there. When can I leave? Elias repeated. The marshal sighed. You're as stubborn as Kane said you were. Fine. Day after tomorrow. But you're taking an armed escort. Just because the Langfords are in custody doesn't mean they don't have friends who might want revenge. Elias nodded. It was good enough. That night, unable to sleep, he walked out onto the fort's walls and stared in the direction of home. Somewhere out there, maybe 3 days' ride away, Lydia and her children were waiting, wondering if he was alive, wondering if the gamble had paid off. He'd sent a telegram as soon as he'd woken up. Just 5 words. Safe, successful, coming home soon. But that didn't feel like enough. Didn't express the weight of what they'd accomplished. Didn't capture the fact that he'd spent 6 days running for his life, carrying their future in his coat, and he'd made it. Penny for your thoughts? Marshal Davis had joined him on the wall, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered one to Elias. Just thinking about what comes next. Going back to your ranch? Back to the quiet life? Elias thought about it. About his cabin that wasn't quite so empty anymore. About a woman with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. About 2 children who'd looked at him like he was a hero, even though he'd never felt less heroic. I don't think my life's going to be quiet anymore, Tim, he said. Davis smiled. Good. Quiet's overrated anyway. Besides, word's already spreading about what you did. Lone rancher takes on a corrupt judge and wins. That's the kind of story people tell around campfires. You're going to be famous, Hart. Don't want to be famous, just want to go home. To your ranch? Or to them? Elias didn't answer, didn't need to. They both knew. 2 days later, escorted by 4 armed marshals, Elias headed back toward Montana. The return journey was slower than the desperate flight away had been. They stopped in towns along the way, and at each one, Elias saw the same thing. Newspapers with headlines about the Langford conspiracy. People talking in the streets about justice finally being served. Other families coming forward with stories of intimidation and fraud. The avalanche had started, and nothing was going to stop it now. When they finally reached the turnoff to Elias's cabin, the marshals insisted on riding with him all the way to his property. Just to make sure you actually get home safe, their leader said with a grin. But as they approached through the trees, Elias saw something that made his heart stop. Smoke rising from the cabin. Too much smoke. The wrong color. He kicked his horse into a gallop, fear clawing at his throat. The cabin wasn't burning, but the door was hanging open, and there were hoof prints in the snow, fresh ones. And the chickens were scattered, the goat pen gate swinging loose. Lydia! Elias was off his horse before it stopped moving, running for the cabin. Mara! Caleb! Empty. The cabin was empty. But there was evidence of a struggle. A chair overturned, the shotgun missing from above the door. And on the table, weighed down with a rock, was a note. Elias's hands shook as he read it. Your documents have destroyed my father, cost me everything I've worked for, but I still have leverage. I still have them. Come to the old mine at Snake Canyon. Come alone. Come unarmed. And maybe I'll let them live. You have until sunset. Victor Langford. The note was dated yesterday. Elias looked at the marshals who'd followed him inside. How fast can we get to Snake Canyon? 3 hours if we ride hard, but Hart, this is obviously a trap. I know it's a trap. Elias was already moving, checking his rifle, loading his pistol. I don't care. He has them. He has Lydia and her children. Then we do this smart. We bring every marshal we can muster. We surround the mine. There's no time for smart. Elias's voice cracked. He said sunset yesterday. They've already been prisoners for 24 hours. Every minute we waste planning is another minute they're in danger. The lead marshal gripped Elias's shoulder. Listen to me. I know you're scared, but going in there alone and unarmed like he wants is suicide. He's going to kill you and then kill them anyway. That's how men like Victor Langford operate. So what do you suggest? We go in with force, fast and hard. Don't give him time to hurt them. Elias wanted to argue, wanted to do exactly what Victor demanded, trade himself for their safety. But he knew the marshal was right. Victor wasn't going to honor any deal. This was about revenge now, pure and simple. All right, Elias said, but we leave now. And if anyone gets hurt because we move too slow, I'm holding you responsible. They rode like demons were chasing them, pushing their horses to the breaking point. Elias's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Had Victor already hurt them? Was Caleb's illness coming back in the stress? Was Mara still fighting, still fierce, or had they broken her spirit? Was Lydia even still alive? He couldn't think like that. Couldn't let himself imagine the worst, or he'd go mad. Snake Canyon loomed ahead, the old mine entrance a dark mouth in the hillside. There were horses tied outside. At least 4. The marshals spread out, taking positions on the canyon rim and in the rocks around the mine entrance. Elias dismounted 100 yards out and approached on foot, rifle in hand, despite Victor's demand that he come unarmed. "Victor Langford," he called. "I'm here! Let them go!" For a long moment, nothing. Then Victor emerged from the mine, and Elias's blood ran cold. He was holding Caleb in front of him like a shield, a pistol pressed to the boy's head. Behind him, the scarred man dragged Lydia and Mara out into the light. Both women were bound, both had been beaten. Lydia's eye was swollen shut. Mara's lip was split again, worse than before. "You came," Victor said. His voice was strange, high-pitched, and barely controlled. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I thought you might be smarter than that." "Let them go. This is between you and me." "No!" Victor pressed the gun harder against Caleb's head, making the boy whimper. "This is between me and everyone who destroyed my family. My father is in prison. Our assets are frozen. Our name is ruined, all because of you and this bitch and her meddling dead husband." "Your father destroyed himself," Elias said calmly, though his finger was tight on the rifle's trigger. "He killed 23 men. He stole from dozens of families. You're just reaping what he sowed. He was making the territory better, creating progress. The railroad brings civilization, jobs, the future." Victor's eyes were wild. "But people like you and her, you couldn't see that. You had to destroy everything." Elias took a step forward. "Put down the gun, Victor. It's over. You're already facing federal charges. Don't add murder to the list." "Murder?" Victor laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think I care about murder charges? I'm already going to prison for the rest of my life. So why not? Why not take you all with me?" He cocked the pistol. Everything happened at once. Elias brought up his rifle. The marshals opened fire from their hidden positions. Victor pulled his trigger. But Caleb, weak little Caleb who could barely breathe most days, twisted in Victor's grip and bit down on his captor's gun hand with every ounce of strength he had. The pistol went off, the bullet going wide. Victor screamed and dropped Caleb. The boy fell hard but rolled away, out of the line of fire. The scarred man shoved Lydia and Mara aside and drew his own weapon. Elias shot him through the shoulder before he could aim. The man went down. Victor was fumbling for his dropped pistol. Marshals were running toward him from all directions, shouting orders to surrender. But Victor got his hand on the gun, raised it toward Lydia. And Elias, who'd spent 3 years running from violence, who'd sworn he was done being a killer, who wanted nothing more than a quiet life without blood on his hands. Elias shot Victor Langford through the heart. Victor stood for a moment, a look of surprise on his face. Then he crumpled to the ground and didn't move again. Silence fell over Snake Canyon, broken only by the sound of Lydia sobbing and Mara's fierce whisper of, "We're okay, Mama. We're okay." Elias ran to them, cut their bonds with his knife, pulled them into an embrace that was probably too tight, but he couldn't help it. They were alive, bruised and scared, but alive. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry. I should have been there. Should have protected you better. I'm sorry." "You came," Lydia said through her tears. "You came for us. That's all that matters." Caleb wrapped his small arms around Elias's leg. "I bit him. Did you see? I bit him real hard." "I saw." Elias's voice was rough. "You were so brave. You saved your own life. I'm proud of you." Marshal Davis was checking Victor's body. He looked up and met Elias's eyes. "Clean shoot, self-defense, dozen witnesses. You did what you had to do." Elias nodded. He'd killed men before, in his years as a marshal. It never got easier. But this time, looking at the family he'd saved, he felt something different than the usual guilt and regret. He felt certainty. That this had been right. Necessary. Just. They rode back to the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in shades of red and gold. The marshals stayed the night, making sure there were no other surprises, no other Langford associates seeking revenge. But by morning, word had spread. Judge Langford's conspiracy had been completely exposed. Victor's death had been ruled justified. And the territorial governor had issued an official proclamation returning all stolen properties to their rightful owners. It was over. Really, truly over. As the marshals prepared to leave, Davis pulled Elias aside one last time. "You did good work here, Hart. The kind of work that reminds me why I became a marshal in the first place. If you ever want your badge back, just say the word." "I'm done with badges," Elias said. "Got other responsibilities now." Davis glanced at Lydia, who was making breakfast with Mara's help while Caleb played with a carved wooden horse one of the marshals had given him. "Yeah," Davis said with a smile. "I can see that. Take care of them, Hart. They're good people. And so are you, whether you believe it or not." After the marshals left, the cabin felt quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet than Elias had lived with for 3 years. This was the quiet of safety, of peace, of a battle won and a future secured. That night, after the children were asleep, Elias and Lydia sat by the fire, neither quite ready to break the comfortable silence. Finally, Lydia spoke. "You killed a man for us. I killed a man who was about to murder you. There's a difference." "Is there? To you, I mean. Does it haunt you?" Elias considered the question honestly. "I've killed 17 men in my life. Most of them deserved it. All of them haunt me, at least a little. But Victor?" He shook his head. "Victor chose his path. He had every chance to stop, to do the right thing, to accept justice. Instead, he chose revenge and cruelty. I don't regret what I did. I'd do it again." Lydia reached over and took his hand. "Thank you for everything. For taking us in that first night, for fighting the Langfords, for riding across 3 territories with evidence, for coming back for us even when it meant walking into a trap. Thomas was a good man, but even he never fought for us the way you have." "Thomas died trying to do the right thing. He's a hero." "So are you." Elias started to protest, but Lydia put a finger to his lips. "Don't argue with me, Elias Hart. I may be a widow and poor and beaten up, but I know a hero when I see one. And you're looking at a man who saved 3 lives and brought down a corrupt empire. That's a hero in my book." In the firelight, with her bruised face and fierce eyes and stubborn set to her jaw, Lydia Rowan was the most beautiful thing Elias had ever seen. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now we rebuild. The governor is returning our property. The other families are getting their land back too. There's talk of forming a new settlement, working together, creating something strong enough that no corrupt judge can ever threaten us again." She squeezed his hand. "And I'd like you to be part of that, if you want." "I want." Even though it means noise and community and having neighbors and all the things you've been avoiding for 3 years? Even though, Elias smiled, really smiled, for the first time in as long as he could remember. Turns out isolation isn't as peaceful as I thought. Turns out I like having people to care about, people who need me. We do need you, Lydia said softly. But more than that, we want you. In our lives. Not as a protector or a savior, but as family. Family. The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the pines. Inside, the fire crackled and children breathed softly in sleep. And two people who'd both lost everything found themselves holding on to something that felt an awful lot like hope. The trial of Judge Thaddeus Langford began on a cold morning in March, 3 months after Victor's death at Snake Canyon. Elias stood on the courthouse steps in Helena, the territorial capital, watching a crowd of nearly 200 people gather outside. Some were families who'd had their land stolen. Others were reporters from newspapers as far away as San Francisco and Chicago. A few were just curious citizens who wanted to see a powerful man brought low. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Federal prosecutors had brought charges that filled 17 pages: conspiracy, fraud, extortion, accessory to murder, corruption of office, and a dozen other crimes that added up to what everyone knew would be a life sentence if the jury convicted. Elias sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, Lydia beside him. Her hands were folded in her lap, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw was set. Mara sat on her other side, dressed in the new clothes the territorial governor's office had provided, a simple blue dress that made her look older than her 12 years. Caleb was back at the fort with Marshall Davis's wife, still too young and too fragile to sit through days of testimony about his father's murder. Judge Langford was led into the courtroom in chains. He was a big man, barrel-chested and gray-haired, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Even in shackles, even facing destruction, he carried himself with an arrogance that made Elias's hands curl into fists. The judge's eyes swept the courtroom and landed on Lydia. For just a moment, something flickered in his expression. Not remorse, nothing so human as that, but perhaps calculation. Recognition that this woman he'd tried to destroy was going to be instrumental in destroying him. Lydia met his gaze and didn't look away, didn't flinch. After everything she'd survived, a corrupt judge's stare held no power over her anymore. The presiding judge, a federal appointee named Harrison, who'd been brought in specifically because he had no ties to the Langford family, brought the courtroom to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. The Territory versus Thaddeus Langford, opening statements. The lead prosecutor was a sharp-faced woman named Catherine Brennan, who'd made her reputation taking down corruption in the railroad industry. She stood and addressed the jury with the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing she held all the cards. Gentlemen of the jury, over the next week you're going to hear testimony about a conspiracy so vast and so callous that it defies belief. You're going to learn how a man who swore an oath to uphold justice instead twisted the law into a weapon. How he used his position to enrich himself at the expense of hard-working families. How he falsified documents, intimidated witnesses, and orchestrated the deaths of 23 minors to cover his crimes. She paused, letting that number sink in. 23. Not statistics, men with names and families and futures that had been stolen from them. The defense will tell you that Judge Langford is a pillar of the community, that he served this territory faithfully for 15 years, that these charges are the result of a conspiracy against him by malcontents and troublemakers. Brennan's voice hardened. But the evidence will show you the truth, that the only conspiracy here was Judge Langford's, and that the price of that conspiracy was paid in blood and suffering by people who trusted him to protect them. She returned to her seat. The defense attorney, an expensive lawyer brought in from Chicago, paid for by the Langford family's remaining assets, stood to give his opening statement, but Elias barely heard it. The usual deflections and justifications. The attempt to paint Judge Langford as a victim of circumstance and overzealous prosecution. None of it mattered. The evidence was too strong, the witnesses too credible, the crimes too well documented. The first day of testimony focused on the forged debt documents. A handwriting expert testified that the signature on Lydia's supposed loan papers couldn't possibly have been written by Thomas Rowan, The letter formations were wrong, the pressure inconsistent, the style completely different from known samples of Thomas's writing. The bank clerk who'd been coerced into notarizing the false documents broke down on the stand, admitting through tears that Judge Langford had threatened to have him arrested on fabricated charges if he didn't cooperate. One by one, the prosecution dismantled the framework of lies that had allowed the land grab to happen. On the second day, they moved to the mine collapse. An engineer testified about the safety reports that had been ignored. A former foreman described being ordered to remove evidence of structural failures from the mine's records, and a railroad executive, granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, explained in clinical detail how the collapse had been encouraged through deliberate negligence. "We needed the mine to close," the executive said, his voice flat and emotionless. "The land was worth more to us empty than operational. Judge Langford assured us that he could manage the legal complications, that any investigation would be cursory at best. He said," the man paused, checking his notes. He said, "Dead miners don't file lawsuits, and their widows are easily intimidated." A gasp ran through the courtroom. Even Judge Langford's lawyer looked stricken. Those words, spoken so casually, reduced 23 deaths to a business calculation. Elias felt Lydia trembling beside him. He reached over and took her hand, not caring who saw. She gripped his fingers so hard it hurt, but he didn't pull away. On the third day, Lydia was called to testify. She stood slowly, smoothed her dress, and walked to the witness stand with her head high. The bailiff swore her in, and she sat facing the courtroom, facing the man who'd ordered her husband's death. Prosecutor Brennan approached gently. "Mrs. Rowan, can you tell the court about your husband, Thomas?" Lydia's voice was steady. "Thomas was a good man, a hard worker. He couldn't read or write more than his name, but he was smart and he was honest. When he saw something wrong, he spoke up, even when it was dangerous, especially when it was dangerous." "And what did he see wrong at the Silver Pine mine?" "Everything." Lydia looked directly at Judge Langford. "He saw equipment that should have been replaced but wasn't, support beams that were rotting, safety protocols that were being ignored, and he saw documents that proved the mine's closure was planned, that the collapse wasn't an accident waiting to happen, it was an inevitability that had been engineered." "What did your husband do with this information?" "He tried to report it, filed complaints with the foreman, then with the mine owner, then with the territorial marshal. He kept copies of everything he found, even though he couldn't read them himself. He asked me to read them to him, and we both knew what he'd discovered was dangerous." Brennan held up a folder. "Are these the documents your husband found?" Lydia leaned forward, examining them. "Yes. Those are Thomas's copies. He hid them under a floorboard in our cabin. After he died, after the collapse, I looked for them, but they were gone. Someone had broken in and taken them." "Did your husband ever mention Judge Langford specifically?" "Yes. Thomas said the judge was the one coordinating everything with the railroad, that the mine closure, the land acquisitions, all of it went through Judge Langford's office." Lydia's voice grew stronger. "Thomas was going to testify against him. He'd filed a formal complaint 2 weeks before the collapse. And 3 days after he filed that complaint, my husband and 22 other men died in Section 7 when the support beams, the exact beams Thomas had reported as dangerous, gave way." "Mrs. Rowan, do you believe your husband's death was an accident?" The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection! Calls for speculation." "I'll rephrase," Brennan said smoothly. "Mrs. Rowan, based on your husband's reports and the subsequent investigation, what conclusion did you reach about the cause of the collapse?" "Thomas was murdered," Lydia said clearly. "He and 22 other men were murdered to silence them and to clear the way for the railroad. And the man who ordered those murders is sitting right there." She pointed directly at Judge Langford. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. "Order! The witness will refrain from accusations not in evidence." But the damage was done. The jury had seen a widow, still grieving, point an accusing finger at the man who'd destroyed her life. No amount of legal maneuvering could erase that image. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to paint Lydia as a bitter woman seeking revenge, suggested she'd fabricated evidence, implied she was being manipulated by outside agitators who wanted to discredit Judge Langford. Lydia weathered it all with quiet dignity. When the lawyer tried to rattle her by asking why she'd never remarried if she'd truly loved her husband, she looked him straight in the eye and said, "Because I've been too busy fighting for justice for Thomas to think about my own happiness. But I'm thinking about it now. And when this trial is over, when that man is in prison where he belongs, maybe I'll finally be able to move forward with my life." She stepped down from the witness stand and walked back to her seat. Elias could see tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. She'd done it. She'd faced down her husband's killer and spoken her truth, and nothing the defense attorney had thrown at her had made her waver. "You were incredible," Elias whispered as she sat down. "I was terrified," Lydia admitted, "but I kept thinking about Thomas, about how brave he was, and about you, and how you rode 3 territories to get evidence. If you could do that, I could sit in a chair and tell the truth." On the 4th day, Elias was called to testify. He'd been dreading this. Public speaking had never been his strength. He was a man of action, not words. But as he sat in the witness box and looked out at the packed courtroom, he thought about all the people counting on him. Not just Lydia and her children, but the other 14 families. The widows of the dead miners. The future families who might face similar corruption if Judge Langford wasn't stopped. Prosecutor Brennan began with easy questions: his name, his background, his years as a federal marshal. Then she moved to the night he'd first encountered the Langfords. Elias described finding Lydia and her children in their collapsing cabin, eating garbage, being threatened by Victor Langford and his men. He described the fake debt documents, the threats, the implied violence. "What made you decide to intervene, Mr. Hart?" Elias was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I'd spent 3 years hiding from the world, telling myself that getting involved only led to pain, that I'd failed the people I loved, and the best thing I could do was stay out of everyone's way." He looked at Lydia. "But when I saw those children starving, when I saw a widow being threatened in her own home, I realized that not acting was its own kind of failure, maybe worse than the failure I'd been running from." "So you took them in?" "I took them in, and then I started asking questions, started investigating. And what I found..." Elias pulled out the documents he'd stolen from the warehouse, now entered as evidence. "What I found was a conspiracy that went back years. Fake debts, forged signatures, land seizures based on fraudulent legal documents, all of it coordinated through Judge Langford's office." Brennan walked him through the break-in at the warehouse, the 6-day chase to Fort Jameson, the confrontation at Snake Canyon. Elias kept his testimony factual, unemotional, the way he'd been trained as a marshal. Just the facts. But when Brennan asked him about the final confrontation with Victor, about the moment he'd pulled the trigger, Elias let some of his emotion show. "He was going to kill her," Elias said simply. "Victor had a gun pointed at Lydia. He'd already murdered in cold blood. He'd shot at me multiple times, had taken hostages, had beaten a woman and children. There was no doubt in my mind what he intended to do, so I stopped him, the only way I could." "Do you regret killing Victor Langford?" The defense attorney objected, but Judge Harrison overruled him. "The witness may answer." Elias met Judge Langford's eyes. "No, sir, I do not. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that his father's corruption and cruelty created a man who thought violence and intimidation were acceptable tools, but I don't regret saving an innocent woman's life." The defense attorney's cross-examination tried to paint Elias as a vigilante who'd taken the law into his own hands, tried to suggest his relationship with Lydia had clouded his judgment, made him act rashly. "Isn't it true, Mr. Hart, that you were emotionally compromised? That your feelings for Mrs. Rowan led you to exaggerate the threat posed by the Langford family?" Elias considered the question. "I care about Mrs. Rowan and her children. I won't deny that. But the evidence I gathered has nothing to do with my feelings. Those documents," he pointed to the stack on the prosecution's table, "those contracts and letters and financial records speak for themselves. They show a pattern of criminal activity spanning 5 years. My feelings didn't create that evidence. Judge Langford's crimes did." "But you admit you broke into private property to obtain that evidence." "I do." "You admit you stole documents that didn't belong to you." "I admit I took evidence of criminal conspiracy from the criminals who created it." Elias leaned forward. "And if I had to do it again, I would. Because sometimes the law moves too slowly to save the innocent. Sometimes good men have to act outside the strict boundaries of legal procedure to prevent greater injustices. So you believe you're above the law? No. I believe the law is meant to protect people, not power. And when men like Judge Langford twist the law into a weapon, someone has to stand against them. Elias's voice was steady. I wore a badge for 5 years. I know what the law is supposed to be. And what Judge Langford did wasn't law. It was tyranny dressed up in legal language. The defense attorney had no response to that. He dismissed Elias with a wave of his hand as if the testimony had been inconsequential. But the jury's faces told a different story. They'd heard a man admit to breaking the law and explain exactly why he'd had no other choice. The testimony continued for 2 more days. More families came forward to describe how they'd been forced off their land. More witnesses detailed Judge Langford's involvement in the conspiracy. The evidence mounted until it became overwhelming, undeniable. On the 7th day, both sides rested their cases. The judge instructed the jury, explaining the legal standards they needed to apply. Then the 12 men filed out to deliberate. Elias, Lydia, and Mara waited in a small room behind the courtroom. The minutes stretched into hours. Lydia paced. Mara sat rigid in her chair. Elias stood by the window watching storm clouds gather over Helena. What if they acquit him? Lydia finally said. What if his lawyers convince them that we're all lying? They won't, Elias said with more confidence than he felt. The evidence is too strong. Evidence can be dismissed. Witnesses can be discredited. Juries can be swayed by expensive lawyers and important names. Lydia's voice cracked. What if we went through all of this for nothing? Elias turned from the window and pulled her into his arms. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed against his chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. We didn't go through this for nothing, he said into her hair. Even if the jury acquits him, which they won't, we exposed what he did. We got the truth out there. We gave those other families their land back. We stopped the conspiracy. That's not nothing. I want him to pay, Lydia whispered fiercely. I want him to suffer the way Thomas suffered, the way all those families suffered. He will. One way or another, he will. 4 hours after they'd begun deliberations, the jury returned. The courtroom filled again. Judge Langford was brought back to the defense table, his face unreadable. The jury foreman stood, a piece of paper trembling in his hands. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the tense silence. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, how do you find? Guilty. A wave of sound swept through the courtroom. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, but the noise continued as the foreman read verdict after verdict. Guilty of extortion, guilty of corruption, guilty of accessory to murder, guilty, guilty, guilty. 17 charges, 17 guilty verdicts. Judge Langford's face had gone ashen. His lawyer was already standing, already calling for appeals and new trials and procedural reviews. But it was over. Everyone in that courtroom knew it was over. Judge Harrison set sentencing for 1 week later. In the meantime, Judge Langford would remain in custody. As the bailiffs led him away, the former judge turned and looked back at Lydia one final time. She met his gaze and spoke clearly enough for him to hear. Thomas Rowan sends his regards. Then Judge Langford was gone, shuffling out in chains, and Lydia turned and buried her face in Elias's chest and finally let herself cry. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them. Elias pushed through, shielding Lydia and Mara, until they reached the relative quiet of a nearby park. They sat on a bench, the 3 of them, not speaking, just breathing, letting the reality sink in. It's really over, Mara said softly. Isn't it? It's really over, Elias confirmed. What happens now? Before anyone could answer, a commotion erupted near the courthouse. Shouting, screaming, the sound of gunfire. Elias was on his feet instantly, pushing Lydia and Mara behind him, his hand going to the pistol he'd been allowed to carry as a material witness. A man burst through the crowd of reporters, tall, wild-eyed, with a rifle in his hands. One of Judge Langford's associates, Elias realized with sinking dread. One of the men who'd escaped arrest. This is your fault, the man screamed, raising his rifle. All of it. You destroyed everything. The rifle swung toward Lydia. Time seemed to slow. Elias could see the man's finger tightening on the trigger, could see Lydia's eyes going wide with terror, could see Mara starting to scream. He moved without thinking, threw himself in front of Lydia just as the rifle cracked. The bullet hit him high in the chest, spinning him around. A second shot caught him in the shoulder. He went down hard, the taste of copper flooding his mouth. Through a haze of pain, he heard more gunshots, marshals returning fire. The rifle clattered to the ground. Someone was screaming, Lydia, he realized, calling his name. Hands pressed against his chest. Lydia's hands, trying to stop the bleeding. "Don't you dare!" she was sobbing. "Don't you dare leave me! Not now, not after everything. Elias, please!" He tried to speak, tried to tell her it would be okay. But his mouth wouldn't form words. The sky above was very blue, he noticed. Beautiful, even. Like the sky on the day he'd married his first wife all those years ago. "Get a doctor!" Mara was screaming. "Someone get a doctor!" Elias felt himself starting to float. The pain was fading, which he knew wasn't a good sign. He'd seen enough gunshot wounds to know what that meant. Lydia's face appeared above him, blocking out that beautiful sky. Her tears fell on his face like rain. "I love you," she said desperately. "Do you hear me, Elias Hart? I love you. So you have to stay. You have to fight. For me. For the children. For the life we're going to have together." Love. The word echoed in his fading consciousness. When had that happened? When had care turned to love? Maybe it had been there all along, from that first night when he'd carried her children through the blizzard. Maybe it had grown slowly, in quiet moments by the fire. Maybe it didn't matter when. What mattered was that she loved him, and he loved her, and he'd just taken 2 bullets to keep her alive, just like Thomas had died to protect his family. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 3 years avoiding this exact scenario, caring enough about someone to die for them. And here he was anyway, bleeding out on the streets of Helena because he'd chosen to care. But looking up at Lydia's face, seeing the love and terror in her eyes, Elias found he didn't regret it. Not even a little bit. If these were his last moments, at least they were spent protecting someone worth dying for. Darkness crept in at the edges of his vision. Voices grew distant. The last thing he heard before unconsciousness claimed him was Lydia's voice, fierce and desperate. "Stay with me. Please, Elias, stay with me." He tried. God knows he tried. Elias woke to whiteness and pain. Sterile white walls, white bandages wrapped around his torso, pain that felt like someone had stuck a hot poker through his chest and left it there. For a moment he thought he was dead. Then the pain convinced him otherwise. Death probably didn't hurt this much. "Easy." A woman's voice, unfamiliar and professional. A nurse, he realized, as she came into focus beside his bed. "You're at St. Vincent's Hospital in Helena. You've been unconscious for 3 days. Try not to move too quickly." 3 days. Elias's mind struggled to process that. "Lydia," he croaked. "Where?" "She's right here." The nurse stepped aside, and there was Lydia, rising from a chair she'd clearly been sleeping in. Her face was haggard, her eyes red from crying, but she was smiling. "She hasn't left your side except when the doctors forced her to." Lydia reached the bed and took his hand so gently it was like being touched by a ghost. "You're awake. Oh God, you're actually awake. The doctors said, they said you might not..." Her voice broke. "Hard to kill," Elias managed. His throat felt like sandpaper. "Apparently." 2 bullets, Lydia said, her voice shaking between laughter and tears. "You took 2 bullets for me. The doctor said if either one had been an inch to the left, you'd be dead. An inch, Elias." "Worth it." He squeezed her hand weakly. "You're safe. That's all that matters." No, it's not all that matters." Lydia leaned closer and he could see the intensity burning in her eyes. "You matter. Your life matters, not just as our protector or our savior, but as yourself. As the man I..." She stopped, took a breath. "As the man I love." Even through the haze of pain and medication, those words hit him like lightning. "You said that before," he whispered. "When I was bleeding. I thought I dreamed it." "You didn't dream it. I love you, Elias Hart. I think I've loved you since that first night when you carried my son through a blizzard. Maybe longer. Maybe from the moment you stood up to Victor Langford and refused to let him hurt my children. Tears streamed down her face. And when I saw you fall, when I thought I was going to lose you, you're not losing me. Elias tried to sit up, gasped at the pain, but forced himself upright anyway. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. The doctor says you need months of recovery, that the bullets did serious damage, that you'll probably never regain full use of your right shoulder. Don't care. He cupped her face with his good hand. As long as I can hold you, I don't care about anything else. They kissed, gentle and careful, mindful of his injuries, but full of all the emotion they'd been holding back. When they finally pulled apart, Lydia was crying again, but this time they were happy tears. Mara and Caleb? Elias asked. Downstairs with Marshall Davis's wife. They've been worried sick. I'll bring them up now that you're awake. Lydia stood, then paused. The man who shot you, he's dead. The marshals killed him before he could hurt anyone else, and Judge Langford was sentenced yesterday. Life in federal prison with no possibility of parole. The judge made a special note that he's to be held in maximum security, away from any possible allies or corrupt officials who might try to help him. Good. Elias felt a weight lift from his chest that had nothing to do with bullet wounds. It's finally over then. Yes. And now we get to figure out what comes next. What came next was harder than Elias had anticipated. Recovery was slow and painful. There were days when he couldn't get out of bed without help, days when the pain was so intense he couldn't think straight, days when he wondered if he'd ever be the man he'd been before. But Lydia was there through all of it. She changed his bandages, brought him food, read to him when he couldn't sleep. Mara helped with the cabin's chores he couldn't manage. And Caleb, growing stronger every day, would sit beside Elias's bed and talk about everything and nothing, school lessons, the chickens, the goats, his dreams for the future. They became a family in those months of recovery, not through blood or legal documents, but through the simple act of caring for each other day after day. Marshall Davis visited regularly, bringing news of the outside world. All 15 families had received their land back. The railroad had been forced to renegotiate their expansion plans through legal channels. Several other corrupt officials connected to Judge Langford had been arrested and tried. You started something big, Hart, Davis said one afternoon, sitting beside Elias's bed. Counties all across the territory are reviewing their land records, looking for similar frauds. Congress is talking about new oversight for territorial judges. What you and Mrs. Rowan did, it's going to change how the law works out here. We just wanted justice for Thomas, Lydia said quietly. Well, you got that. And a whole lot more. Davis stood to leave, then paused. The territorial governor sent a commendation, official recognition for your service in exposing the conspiracy. There's a ceremony in 3 months if you're well enough to attend. We'll be there, Elias said. After Davis left, Lydia helped Elias walk out onto the porch. It was the first time he'd been outside in weeks. The Montana spring was in full bloom, the mountains green and alive. I've been thinking, Lydia said as they sat together on the porch swing he'd built during his recovery, about the future, about what we're building here. And I think Thomas would approve of us, of this. She gestured at the cabin, the land, the life they were creating. He loved me, but he'd want me to be happy, to move forward, to give Mara and Caleb a real home with a man who loves them. Elias took her hand. I do love them, and I love you. But I need you to know I'm never going to replace Thomas. He was their father. He was your husband. He was a hero. I can't be him. I don't want you to be him, Lydia said firmly. I want you to be you, the man who saved us, the man who fought for justice, the man who took 2 bullets to protect me. She turned to face him fully. The man I want to spend the rest of my life with. Elias's heart was pounding. Lydia Rowan, are you proposing to me? Maybe I am. She smiled, that fierce, beautiful smile he'd come to love. What are you going to do about it? I'm going to say yes. He pulled her closer, kissing her softly. Yes to marriage, yes to family, yes to whatever future we can build together. Even though it means giving up your solitude, your quiet life. Especially because of that. Elias looked out at the mountains, at the land that had seen so much pain and was now blooming with hope. I tried quiet, tried isolation. Nearly killed me from the inside out. He gestured at the cabin, where Mara was teaching Caleb to read, and their laughter drifted through the open window. This is what I should have been looking for all along. Not silence, connection, not isolation. Family. They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Somewhere in the distance, neighbors were arriving. The other families who'd had their land restored, coming together to help build a new barn on Elias's property. A community forming from the ashes of the Langfords' greed. And for the first time since he'd buried his first family 3 years ago, Elias' heart felt something he'd thought was lost forever. He felt whole. The wedding took place on a Sunday morning in late May, when the wildflowers had turned the Montana valleys into seas of purple and gold. Elias stood at the front of his rebuilt cabin, expanded now with 2 additional rooms thanks to the neighboring families who'd come together to help, and watched Lydia walk toward him through the meadow. She wore a simple dress the color of cream, wildflowers woven into her hair by Mara's careful hands. She wasn't being given away by anyone, wasn't following tradition that said a woman needed a man's permission to choose her own future. She walked alone, head high, eyes locked on Elias, and every step was a choice she was making for herself. Behind her, Mara and Caleb followed, both dressed in their Sunday best. Caleb's breathing had improved dramatically over the past months. The good food, clean air, and freedom from constant stress had worked better than any medicine. He was still thin, still prone to coughing when the weather turned cold, but he was alive and thriving in ways that had seemed impossible 6 months ago. The gathered crowd was small but significant. Marshall Davis and his wife, the 15 families who'd had their land restored, a few of Elias's old friends from his Marshall days who'd ridden in from across the territory. And standing beside Elias as his best man, surprisingly, was Marshall Kane, the gruff lawman who'd first helped protect Lydia from the Langfords. "Never thought I'd see you settle down again, Hart," Kane had said that morning while helping Elias with his tie. "After what happened to Sarah and Jacob, thought you'd sworn off caring about anyone." "So did I," Elias admitted. "Turns out some people are worth the risk of caring." Now watching Lydia approach with the sun turning her hair to gold, Elias knew he'd been right. She was worth every risk. Worth the pain of opening his heart again. Worth facing his fears of loss and failure. She reached him and took his hands. Her palms were calloused from hard work, her grip strong and sure. This was no delicate flower he was marrying. This was a woman who'd survived starvation and threats and the murder of her first husband, who'd testified against a corrupt judge and rebuilt her life from nothing. The circuit preacher, a kind-faced man who traveled between settlements performing marriages and christenings, opened his worn Bible. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple. Traditional vows with a few personal additions. When it came time for Elias to speak, he looked into Lydia's eyes and said what he'd been practicing for weeks. "I promise to protect you, but not to shield you from life. To support you, but not to make your choices for you. To love you, but not to try to own you." His voice caught slightly. "I promise to be here every day, for whatever comes, good or bad, easy or hard. I'm not going anywhere." Lydia's eyes shimmered with tears. "I promise to trust you, even when fear tells me not to let you help, even when pride tells me I should do it alone, to build a future with you that honors the past without being trapped by it." She squeezed his hands. "And I promise that when life gets difficult, and it will, we'll face it together. No more hiding, no more running, together." "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher said with a warm smile. "You may kiss your bride." Elias pulled Lydia close, mindful of his shoulder that still ached on cold mornings, and kissed her as the crowd erupted in cheers. It was a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and hard-won hope, of second chances and futures rebuilt from ruins. When they finally broke apart, Caleb rushed forward and threw his arms around both of them. "Does this mean you are my papa now?" Elias knelt down, ignoring the protest from his healing injuries, and looked the boy in the eye. "Only if you want me to be. I can never replace your real father. Thomas Rowan was a brave man who loved you very much. But if you'll have me, I'd be honored to be your papa too. Caleb considered this with the seriousness only an 8-year-old could muster. Then he nodded decisively. I think I'd like 2 papas, one who's watching from heaven and one who's here to teach me to ride horses and shoot and fix things. Then that's what you'll have, Elias said, his throat tight with emotion. Mara approached more cautiously, her 12-year-old pride warring with her need for family. I'm too old to start calling you Papa, she said, but I could call you Elias. Or maybe Pa. If that's all right. That's more than all right. Elias stood and pulled her into a hug. And you know what? You don't have to call me anything special. What matters is that we're family now, all of us. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Tables had been set up in the meadow, loaded with food the neighboring families had brought. Someone had a fiddle, another a guitar, and soon music filled the air. Children ran wild through the grass while adults talked and laughed and danced. Elias danced with his new wife, carefully because of his shoulder, joyfully because of everything else. As they swayed to the music, Lydia whispered in his ear, "Happy?" "More than I thought possible," he admitted. "You?" "Terrified," she said honestly, "and happier than I've been in years, both at the same time." "What are you terrified of?" "That this is too good to last, that something will happen to take it all away again." She looked up at him, her fears naked in her eyes. "I've lost so much, Elias. I don't think I could survive losing you too." He pulled her closer, resting his cheek against her hair. "Nothing's guaranteed in this life. I learned that the hard way. But I can promise you this. I'm going to fight like hell to stay alive and by your side for as many years as God gives us. And if something does happen to me, you'll survive it, because you're the strongest person I've ever met. You survived losing Thomas. You survived starvation and threats and everything the Langfords threw at you. You'll survive anything." "I don't want to just survive anymore," Lydia said fiercely. "I want to live, really live." "Then that's what we'll do," Elias smiled, "starting right now." The weeks that followed the wedding were some of the happiest Elias had ever known. He and Lydia settled into the rhythms of married life, learning each other's habits and quirks. She sang while she cooked, off-key but enthusiastic. He had a tendency to wake before dawn and sit on the porch with coffee, watching the sun rise. She was meticulously organized, everything in its place. He was more relaxed about clutter, willing to let dishes sit overnight or leave his tools scattered. They learned to compromise, to communicate, to build a life together that honored both their needs. Mara threw herself into learning everything she could about running a ranch. She could ride as well as any cowboy, could shoot straight, could mend fences and tend livestock with skill beyond her years. She still had nightmares sometimes about the night Victor Langford had taken them hostage, but they were coming less frequently. Caleb was attending the small school that had formed in the growing settlement, learning to read and write with an eagerness that reminded Elias of Thomas Rowan's desire for his children to have the education he'd never received. The boy's health continued to improve, though he'd always be more fragile than other children his age. The settlement itself was thriving. What had started as 15 scattered families had grown to nearly 40 as word spread about available land and a community built on mutual support rather than exploitation. They'd named it Rowan's Hope, in honor of Thomas and the sacrifice that had exposed the Langford conspiracy. A general store had opened, then a blacksmith shop, then a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse. Families were building real homes, planting crops, raising livestock. The railroad had finally come through, but this time with legitimate contracts and fair prices, forced to operate within the law thanks to the scrutiny that had followed the Langford trial. Elias found himself at the center of it all, not because he sought leadership, but because people naturally turned to him for guidance. He'd been elected the settlement's first marshal, a position he'd initially resisted but eventually accepted when Lydia pointed out that his experience and integrity were exactly what the growing community needed. "Besides," she'd said with a teasing smile, "you're terrible at retirement. You need something to keep you busy." She wasn't wrong. Elias thrived on having purpose, on being able to help people solve disputes and keep the peace without the corruption that had poisoned his previous work as a marshal. 6 months after the wedding, on a crisp autumn evening, Elias sat on his porch watching the sun set over the settlement. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys. Lights flickered in windows. The sound of children playing drifted on the wind. From this vantage point, he could see the widow Chen's farm, where she'd expanded her vegetable operation and was now supplying half the territory. He could see the Thornton place, where old Samuel Thornton had built a sawmill that employed a dozen men. He could see the schoolhouse where Mara was helping the teacher with evening classes for adults who'd never learned to read. And he could see his own land, expanded now to include the property that had belonged to Lydia before the Langfords tried to steal it. The cabin where she and Thomas had lived was being renovated, transformed into a guest house for visitors and traveling families who needed shelter. "You're thinking hard," Lydia said, stepping out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and settled into the chair beside his. "What about?" "How different everything is from a year ago. How different I am." "You saved a lot of people, Elias. Changed a lot of lives." "We saved them," he corrected. "You and me and Marshall Kane and everyone who was willing to stand up and tell the truth. I just stole some documents and shot a few people." Lydia laughed, that warm sound he'd come to love. "Just stole some documents and shot a few people. You make it sound so simple." It was, compared to this. He gestured at the settlement. "Building something new, creating a community, raising children, that's harder than any gunfight I've ever been in." "But worth it?" "God, yes, worth every difficult moment." He reached over and took her hand. "Speaking of difficult moments, there's something I need to tell you." Lydia's expression grew cautious. "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous, just complicated." Elias took a breath. "Marshall Davis came by today while you were in town. The territorial governor wants me to come to the capital. There's talk of appointing me as a federal marshal again, overseeing a new anti-corruption task force." "Oh." Lydia's voice was carefully neutral. "That's quite an honor." "It is. It would mean travel, danger, time away from home. All the things I swore I was done with." "But you're considering it." "I was. For about 5 minutes. Then I told Davis to tell the governor thanks, but no thanks. I've got a wife and children and a community that needs me here. I'm not abandoning any of that for a badge, no matter how important the work." Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What if you didn't have to choose?" "What do you mean?" "What if you took the position but made it clear you're based here? That Rowan's Hope is your home and you'll work cases in this region, but you're not traveling to the far corners of the territory?" She squeezed his hand. "You're good at this work, Elias. At finding corruption and stopping it. The governor's right to want you doing it, but you're also good at being a husband and father and community leader. Maybe you can be both." "You'd be okay with me taking on dangerous work again?" "I'd be terrified," Lydia admitted, "but I'd also be proud. And I trust you to be smart about it, to not take unnecessary risks. You're not the same man you were when Sarah and Jacob died. You've learned to let people in, to ask for help, to work as part of a team instead of a lone wolf." She turned to face him fully. "Just promise me one thing." "Anything." "Promise me you'll always come home. No matter what case you're working, no matter what danger you face, you'll do everything in your power to come home to us." "I promise," Elias said solemnly. "On my life, I promise." They sat together in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars began to appear. Inside the cabin, they could hear Mara helping Caleb with his homework, their voices a comforting domestic sound that filled the spaces where loneliness used to live. "There's something I need to tell you too," Lydia said eventually. "I've been keeping a secret for about 2 weeks now, waiting for the right moment." Elias's heart skipped. "A good secret or a bad secret?" "A good secret, I hope." She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, Elias couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at his hand on Lydia's belly, feeling the miracle of new life beginning there. "You're sure?" he finally managed. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. I'm about 2 months along. The baby should come in late spring." Her voice was tremulous with hope and fear. "Are you happy? I know we didn't plan this so soon, and with everything else..." Elias pulled her into his arms, careful and gentle, and buried his face in her hair. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Terrified, yes. Overwhelmed, absolutely. But happy? Lydia, I never thought I'd have another child. Never thought I deserved another chance at being a father after I failed Jacob. This is—" His voice broke. "This is everything." She clung to him, and they both cried, tears of joy and grief and complicated emotion mixing together. Because this baby was a blessing, but it also meant confronting all the old wounds, all the old fears. "I keep thinking about Sarah," Elias confessed. "About how she died bringing Jacob into the world. The complications, the bleeding. What if—" "I'm not Sarah," Lydia said firmly, "and this baby isn't Jacob. We can honor them without letting fear of the past steal the joy of the present." She pulled back to look him in the eye. "I'm strong, Elias. I survived childbirth twice before. I'll survive it again. I know you will. I can't lose you. I can't." "You won't. I'm not going anywhere." She smiled through her tears. "We're building a life together, remember? This baby is part of that life, part of our future." They told the children that night over dinner. Mara's eyes went wide with excitement. "A baby? Really? I can help take care of it." While Caleb looked thoughtful. "Will you love the new baby more than us?" he asked with the brutal honesty of childhood. Elias knelt beside his chair. "A parent's love isn't like a pie that gets divided into smaller pieces. It's like a fire that grows bigger and warmer as you add to it. I loved your mama and you and Mara before this baby. Adding another child just means there's more love, not less. Understand?" Caleb nodded slowly. "I think so. And anyway, it'll be nice to have someone younger than me to boss around." They all laughed, the tension breaking, and the conversation turned to names and nursery arrangements and all the mundane magical details of preparing for a new life. Winter came, harsh and unforgiving as Montana winters always were. But the settlement weathered it together. Families shared resources, checked on elderly neighbors, made sure no one went hungry or cold. It was the community Thomas Rowan had dreamed of when he'd tried to expose the corruption, people looking out for each other instead of being exploited by the powerful. Elias took the position with the territorial governor, but on his own terms, working cases in the surrounding counties while remaining based in Rowan's Hope. He broke up a land fraud scheme in the next territory over, arrested a corrupt sheriff who'd been extorting local businesses, and helped recover stolen property from a gang of train robbers. But he always came home. Always kept his promise to Lydia. And at home, life continued its steady rhythm. Mara turned 13 and announced she wanted to study law, wanted to become a prosecutor like Catherine Brennan, who'd taken down Judge Langford. Caleb's reading improved to the point where he was helping younger children at school. Lydia's pregnancy progressed normally, her belly growing round and her movements becoming careful and deliberate. On a warm spring evening, with apple blossoms falling like snow outside the cabin windows, Lydia's labor began. Elias had faced down armed outlaws without flinching, had stared death in the face more times than he could count, but nothing terrified him like watching his wife's face contort with pain. "I'm fine," she gasped between contractions. "It's normal. It's supposed to hurt. Stop looking like the world's ending." "Easy for you to say," Elias muttered, holding her hand so tight he was probably cutting off her circulation. The midwife they'd brought in from the next settlement, a capable woman named Mrs. Patterson, who'd delivered half the babies in the territory, shooed him away from the bedside. "Mr. Hart, you're making my patient nervous. Either find something useful to do or go outside with the other anxious fathers." "I'm not leaving her." "I didn't say leave. I said find something useful to do." Mrs. Patterson thrust a stack of clean towels at him. "Heat water, lots of it, and keep those children occupied so they don't worry." Elias did as he was told, grateful for tasks that kept his hands busy. He heated water, gathered towels, and sat with Mara and Caleb in the main room, trying to look calm and confident when he felt anything but. "Mama's going to be okay, right?" Caleb asked, his eyes wide with fear. "Your mama is the strongest person I know," Elias said truthfully. "She's going to be just fine." "My real papa, Thomas, he used to say that Mama could survive anything," Mara added softly. "He said she was made of steel wrapped in silk." He was right. Elias pulled both children close. "And in a few hours, we're going to have a new member of our family. A little brother or sister for you two. How does that sound?" "Good," Caleb said. "Scary, but good." It was the most honest assessment Elias had heard all day. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning. Long, difficult hours punctuated by Lydia's cries and the midwife's calm instructions. Elias stayed nearby, alternating between pacing and praying, remembering Sarah's labor that had ended in tragedy and begging God not to let history repeat itself. Just after dawn, when the first light was painting the mountains gold, a baby's cry split the air. Elias was on his feet instantly, moving toward the bedroom. Mrs. Patterson emerged, smiling and exhausted, holding a small bundle wrapped in clean blankets. "Congratulations, Mr. Hart. You have a daughter. Mother and baby are both healthy and doing well." A daughter. Elias's hand shook as he took the tiny bundle, looking down at a small red face, eyes squeezed shut, mouth open in outrage at being born into a cold world. She was perfect, absolutely perfect. "Lydia?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Tired but fine. You can see her in a moment. First introduce your other children to their sister." Mara and Caleb crowded around, their eyes huge as they stared at the baby. "She's so small," Mara breathed. "Was I that small?" Caleb asked. "Smaller," Elias said, his throat tight. "You were both this small once. Hard to believe looking at you now." He let them each hold the baby briefly, carefully supervised, before Mrs. Patterson took her back to clean and check her properly. Then Elias was finally allowed into the bedroom to see Lydia. She lay propped up on pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale and exhausted. But she was smiling, and when she saw him, that smile grew brighter. "We have a daughter," she said. "We have a daughter," Elias repeated, kneeling beside the bed and taking her hand. "And you're okay. You're really okay." "I told you I would be." She squeezed his fingers weakly. "Did you think I'd break my promise?" "I was terrified you would. But you didn't. You're here, and she's here, and we're all okay." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Thank you. For her. For everything. For giving me a family again when I'd given up hope of ever having one." "We gave each other a family," Lydia corrected. "That's how this works. Partnership. Teamwork. Together." Mrs. Patterson brought the baby back, now clean and swaddled, and placed her in Lydia's arms. Mother and daughter gazed at each other, and Elias felt his heart expand to accommodate this new love. "What should we name her?" Lydia asked. They'd discussed names before, but nothing had felt quite right. Now looking at this tiny person who'd fought her way into the world, Elias knew exactly what her name should be. "Hope," he said. "Her name should be Hope, because that's what she represents. What all of this represents." He gestured to encompass the cabin, the settlement beyond, the life they'd built from ruins. Hope that came from darkness. Hope that survived everything that tried to destroy it. Hope for the future. "Hope Rowan Hart," Lydia said, testing it. "Yes, that's perfect." Word of the baby's birth spread quickly through the settlement. By afternoon, families were arriving with gifts, blankets and baby clothes and food for the new parents. The small cabin filled with well-wishers, all wanting to see the newest member of Rowan's Hope. Marshal Davis rode out from Helena specifically to meet Hope, bringing an official letter from the territorial governor congratulating Elias and Lydia on their daughter's birth. "There's also talk of making Rowan's Hope an official township," Davis mentioned as he held the baby with the awkward care of a man unused to infants. "Which means you'd need to elect a mayor, establish a town council, all the legal formalities." "Let me guess," Elias said dryly. "They want me to be mayor." "Actually, the petition I saw had Mrs. Hart's name on it. Seems the ladies in the settlement think a woman's perspective would be valuable in leadership." Lydia, listening from the bed, laughed. "Tell them I'm honored, but I have my hands full with a newborn. Maybe in a few years." "I'll pass that along." Davis handed Hope back to Elias carefully. "You've built something special here, both of you. Thomas Rowan would be proud." After everyone had left and the cabin had finally quieted, Elias sat in the rocking chair he'd made during Lydia's pregnancy, holding his daughter while his wife slept. Through the window, he could see Mara and Caleb playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Hope dozed in his arms, her tiny hand wrapped around his finger with surprising strength. He studied her small features, looking for resemblances. She had Lydia's nose, he thought, maybe his chin. It was too early to tell about her eyes. "You're going to have a good life," he whispered to her. "Your mother and I are going to make sure of it. You'll grow up in a place where justice matters, where people look out for each other, where corruption doesn't get to win. You'll know you're loved and valued and capable of anything you set your mind to. And you'll know about the people who came before you, about Thomas Rowan, who died fighting for what was right, about your grandmother Sarah and Uncle Jacob, who I'll tell you about when you're older, about all the people whose sacrifices made this life possible." Hope stirred, made a small sound, settled back into sleep. "Your mama and I, we've both lost people. We've both survived things that should have broken us, but we didn't break. We bent, and then we came back stronger." Elias rocked gently, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "And now we have you. Living proof that endings can become beginnings, that hope survives even the darkest winters." The door to the bedroom opened, and Lydia emerged, moving carefully. "You're supposed to be sleeping," Elias scolded gently. "Couldn't sleep, wanted to see you two." She settled into the chair beside his. "What were you telling her?" "Everything. Nothing. Just talking." He looked at his wife, this woman who'd changed his life so completely. "Lydia, do you ever regret it? Marrying me? Taking on all the complications that came with me?" "Never. Not once." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you regret it? Taking in a widow and her children? Getting shot protecting us? All of it?" "Best decision I ever made." Elias shifted Hope carefully and put his arm around Lydia. "That night in the blizzard, when I heard those gunshots, I almost didn't go investigate. Almost convinced myself it wasn't my problem." "What changed your mind?" "I don't know. Instinct, maybe. Or fate. Or maybe just the realization that hiding from life wasn't the same as living it." He kissed the top of Lydia's head. "Whatever it was, I'm grateful. Because it led me here. To you. To this family. To a life I never thought I deserved, but somehow got anyway." They sat together as the afternoon faded into evening, watching through the window as the settlement came alive with dinner fires and lamplight. Their settlement. Their community. Their home. Mara came inside first, her arms full of wildflowers she'd picked. "For Mama and baby Hope," she announced, arranging them in a jar with water. Caleb followed, carrying a wooden toy he'd been carving in secret. "It's a horse," he explained, showing it to Elias. "For when Hope gets bigger. Papa helped me. Thomas helped me start it before he died, and you helped me finish it. So it's from both my papas." Elias took the toy, his vision blurring with tears. "It's perfect. She's going to love it." As night fell and the family gathered around the dinner table, Lydia still weak but insisting on being part of things, Hope sleeping in a basket nearby, Mara and Caleb chattering about their day, Elias looked around and felt something settle in his chest. Peace. Real, genuine peace. Not the absence of problems or pain. There would always be challenges ahead, children to raise, work to do, threats to face. Life didn't stop being difficult just because you'd found happiness, but peace in the knowledge that whatever came, they'd face it together. That he wasn't alone anymore. That the family he'd lost had somehow, impossibly, been replaced by a different family, but one no less loved. That night, after the children were in bed and Hope was sleeping soundly, Elias and Lydia stood on their porch, looking out at the settlement. The stars were impossibly bright, the air sweet with spring blossoms. "Do you think Thomas would approve?" Lydia asked quietly. "Of us? Of all this?" Elias considered the question seriously. "I think Thomas loved you enough to want you happy, and I think he'd be grateful that his children have a home and a future and someone who will protect them the way he can't anymore. Beyond that?" He shrugged. "I can't speak for a man I never met, but I like to think he'd understand that if our positions were reversed, I'd want the same for my family." "I still love him," Lydia said. "I always will. But I love you too. Is that wrong?" "No. Love isn't finite. You can love Thomas for the man he was and the father he was to your children, and still love me for who I am now. They're different loves, but both are real." Lydia turned to face him, her eyes bright in the starlight. How did I get so lucky to love two good men in one lifetime? I'm the lucky one, Elias countered. I got a second chance at everything I thought I'd lost. Family, purpose. A reason to wake up in the morning that isn't just surviving. He pulled her close. You saved me, Lydia. Just as much as I saved you that night in the blizzard. Maybe more. Then we're even. Then we're even, he agreed. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the lights of their settlement twinkle in the darkness. Somewhere in that cluster of homes were families who'd been given their land back, their dignity restored, their futures secured. All because one widow had refused to give up, and one broken man had decided to care again. The seasons turned. Hope grew from an infant to a toddler, taking her first steps on wobbly legs while Mara and Caleb cheered. Elias continued his work as a federal marshal, but always came home, always kept his promise. Lydia became more involved in settlement governance, her natural leadership and fierce sense of justice making her invaluable to the community. 2 years after Hope's birth, they gathered at the settlement's new cemetery for the dedication of a memorial. A simple stone marker, but the words carved into it carried weight. In memory of Thomas Rowan and the 22 men who died with him at Silver Pine Mine. Their deaths exposed corruption, and their sacrifice built a better future. May they rest in peace knowing justice was served. Lydia stood before the memorial with her children gathered around her. Mara, now 15 and already talking about law school, Caleb, 10 and healthy and strong, and Hope, 2 years old and trying to understand why Mama was crying. Elias stood slightly apart, giving them space to grieve. This was their moment, their chance to honor the man who'd come before him. But when the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Lydia came to him and took his hand. Thank you, she said simply. For what? For understanding. For honoring Thomas's memory instead of trying to erase it. For being secure enough in yourself and in us to let him be remembered. She squeezed his hand. Not every man would do that. Thomas was a hero. Of course he should be remembered. Elias looked at the memorial. Besides, I'm not competing with him. We both loved you and your children. We both fought for what was right. In a way, we're on the same side. They walked back to their home, expanded now to accommodate their growing family, hand in hand. The settlement had grown too. Nearly 100 families now, with a proper main street, a real school, a church, a doctor's office. Rowan's Hope had become exactly what its name suggested, a place of hope and new beginnings, where people came to escape corruption and build honest lives. That evening, as Elias sat on his porch watching the sun set over the mountains he'd come to love, Marshal Davis rode up with news. Judge Langford died in prison, Davis announced without preamble. Heart attack, the warden said. Quick and relatively painless. Thought you'd want to know. Elias absorbed this information quietly. He'd expected to feel something, satisfaction, perhaps, or vindication, but mostly he just felt tired. How long was he in? 3 years. Would have been life, but I suppose 3 years is what he got. Davis dismounted and joined Elias on the porch. You know, there's a kind of poetry to it. He spent his whole life using the law to hurt people, and in the end, the law caught up to him. He died in a cell, stripped of power, watching everything he built crumble. That's justice. Maybe, Elias thought about it, or maybe justice is this. He gestured at the settlement, at the families living their lives, at the children playing in the streets. People being free, living without fear of corruption, building futures for their kids. That's the real justice. Not what happened to Langford, but what happened because of what he did. The change that came from exposing him. Davis nodded slowly. You're probably right. When's the last time you were wrong about something? This morning. I told Lydia Hope was too young to start climbing trees. Turns out I was very wrong. Elias smiled, remembering his daughter's triumphant face when she'd made it to the first branch. She's fearless, like her mother. And like her father, Davis added. Both of them. After Davis left, Elias went inside to find his family. Lydia was reading to Hope from a picture book. Mara was studying law texts she'd ordered from back east. Caleb was working on his mathematics homework, his tongue poking out in concentration the way it always did when he was thinking hard. This was his life now. Not the violence and loneliness of his years as a marshal. Not the grief-stricken isolation after Sarah and Jacob died. This, family dinners and homework help and bedtime stories, and the thousand small moments that made up a life worth living. Judge Langford died, he told Lydia later, after the children were in bed. She looked up from the mending she was doing. How do you feel about it? Relieved, I think, that he can't hurt anyone else, that the chapter is finally closed. Elias sat beside her. But mostly I'm just grateful for everything that came after, for what we built from the ashes of what he tried to destroy. We did build something good, didn't we? Lydia set down her mending and leaned against him. Sometimes I still can't believe it, that we survived all of that and came out the other side. We survived because we had each other, because we refused to give up. He kissed the top of her head. And we're going to keep surviving, keep building, keep making this life better for our children and everyone else in this settlement. Until we're old and gray and bouncing grandchildren on our knees? Until we're old and gray and bouncing grandchildren on our knees, Elias agreed. And beyond that, whatever comes. Years passed. The settlement continued to grow and prosper. Mara went to law school in the East, came back as a prosecutor, and built a reputation for fighting corruption just like Catherine Brennan had. Caleb became a teacher, dedicated to making sure every child in Rowan's Hope had the education his father had been denied. Hope grew into a fierce, intelligent girl who wanted to be a federal marshal like her father. Elias and Lydia grew older together, their love deepening with time and shared experience. They faced challenges, droughts and harsh winters, economic downturns, and the occasional threat from those who resented the settlement's success. But they faced everything together, supported by the community they'd helped build and the family they'd created. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they stood together on the hill above the settlement, looking down at what had once been wilderness and was now a thriving town. The original 15 families had multiplied. There was talk of Rowan's Hope becoming the county seat, of bringing more development and opportunity. Do you ever regret it? Lydia asked, echoing the question from so many years ago. Giving up your quiet life for all this noise and chaos and community? Elias pulled her close, his hair gray now, his body marked by old wounds and hard years, but his heart full in a way it had never been during those years of isolation. Not once, not ever. You asked me once what we are, partners, friends, something more. Remember? I remember. And I told you we're home. That's still true. You're my home, Lydia. You and the children and this place we built together. Everything else, the town, the work, all of it, that's just details. But you're home. She turned in his arms and kissed him, and even after 20 years of marriage, it still felt like coming home, like finding the place he'd been searching for all his life. Below them, the settlement was coming alive with evening lights. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played in the streets, families gathered for dinner. Life continued in all its messy, beautiful complexity. And standing on that hill, holding the woman who'd changed his life, Elias' heart finally understood what he'd been searching for during all those dark years of isolation. Not silence, not solitude, not escape from pain, but this, connection, family, purpose. A reason to fight and love and wake up each morning, a reason to hope. They walked back down to their home. The cabin expanded so many times it was barely recognizable from the simple structure it had been, hand in hand. Their children and grandchildren would be arriving soon for the anniversary celebration. There would be food and music and laughter, the kind of joyful noise that filled the spaces where silence used to live. Elias paused at the door and looked back one last time at the settlement. At Rowan's Hope, named for a man who'd died fighting for justice, built by people who'd refused to let corruption win, sustained by a community that understood the value of standing together. This was Thomas Rowan's legacy. And it was Elias's legacy too. And it was the legacy they'd leave for their children and grandchildren. A place where hope survived the darkness, where justice mattered more than power, where people took care of each other, where a gunshot in a blizzard had led to redemption, where a widow's courage had exposed corruption, where a broken man had learned to be whole again, where 6 words spoken on a winter night, "Get your things, you're coming home," had changed everything. Lydia squeezed his hand. "Ready to go in?" Elias smiled, really smiled, the way he'd learned to do again over these 20 years. Ready? They walked inside together, into warmth and light and the sound of family gathering, into the home they'd built from nothing but determination and hope and love, into the life they'd chosen, fought for, and earned. Home.